So Pete, would you take us forward on that item?
Yeah, great. For the record, Pete Goldman, Bureau Planning staff. I'm the case planner on this project. Today's meeting is for a design review discussion of the Oakland Waterfront Ballpark District Plan Unit Development. The project includes a 35,000 seat Major League Baseball ballpark, up to 3,000 units of residential units, up to 1.5 million square feet of office, up to 270,000 square feet of retail. It also includes a performance center with approximately a capacity of 3,500 attendees. It also includes hotel uses with up to 280 square feet of floor area and 400 rooms. The project also includes approximately 18.3 acres of publicly available open space, which would be privately owned. As mentioned, the purpose of this meeting is to receive comments on the design issues related to the PUD application only. No decisions on the project will be made today. As mentioned, this will be proceeding to the full planning commission along with all the other related entitlements, including but not limited to the required general plan amendment, the rezoning application, as well as a development agreement, as well as a discussion of the certification of the EIR for the project. The Planning Commission will act as a recommending body to the City Council that will hear all of these items and will be the decision-making body on the project. Before I get into the details, I did just want to give a background on the PUD process or the planning and development process. When applications are filed for a plan unit development, the first step is what's called the preliminary development plan. The preliminary development plan basically lays out the site program, the development program. So it has the street grid laid out where all the development parcels would be, including horizontal infrastructure, streets, sidewalks, and all of those details. The development program also includes maximum heights, densities, and commercial intensities. Often preliminary development plans also include a set of design guidelines. And what those do is they basically guide the development as it moves forward past the preliminary stage. And that the plan unit development is then implemented through applications that often come at a later time. They can come concurrently, but they can also come at a later date. These are called final development permits. And these would basically include several phases throughout the site. This includes the infrastructure with regard to all of the street sidewalks, all the underground infrastructure for servicing the development, as well as the preparation of future development parcels, and in this case, also all of the waterfront parks. So all of those would be coming forward in phases in the future as final development plans. And I just want to make sure that it's not confused for people that have been following along with the EIR process, where there's a discussion of phasing for construction. That is particular to the EIR with regard to phase 1 and phase 2. The phases for, and that's generally everything east of Market to some level of development, and then west of Market for the build out of the remainder of the site. As mentioned, the project includes larger phasing. And in this scenario, basically the site instruct for the large first phase, it basically capture all the site infrastructure, Market and east, which would include the ballpark and all the surrounding parcel site preparation. Also, to some extent, of the waterfront parks, but that phasing is yet to be determined, and that's being negotiated as part of the development agreement. The area west of Market would be an interim surface parking lot until the larger phase 2 infrastructure build out of the remainder of the site occurs. The phase 2 is partially dependent upon what's cited as the Maritime Reserve scenario. And what this is that it's a portion of land of approximately 10 acres that the port may take back for future expansion of the turning basin. Under that scenario, it would reduce the site area, but the overall development program would still be the same. It would just be more dense development on the smaller site. The project also includes what's called the peaker plant project variant, which is related to the PG&E plant. These are properties owned by Vistra. And this includes the PG&E station and the associated fuel tank. And that's really contingent upon the applicant getting site acquisition and purchasing those sites. If they are, they would be incorporated into the project as future final development plan phases. And that would basically, it would retain the PG&E building, but it would be repurposed as a battery storage facility. And it also includes a portion of the rear western wing of the building that may be reduced. And the purpose of that is to increase the pedestrian flow through A's Way coming up into Water Street. And Athletics Way is the plaza street that encircles the ballpark within the development site. The gas tank or the fuel tank as part of that would basically be demolished and be repurposed to a future development site as well. But it would not change the overall development program. It would just locate portions of the development within that site as a future FDP as well. As mentioned, the preliminary development plan in PUD also contains a set of design guidelines. And as mentioned, this will guide the future final development permit submittals, including all the infrastructure, streetscape, parks, as well as the development parcels. The basic program that's set forth in those design guidelines that were submitted is sort of set on these character streets that are laid out. And this is, it sort of points to Market Street being main arterial, and then it breaks it out to the character of Athletics Way, as well as Filbert Street, which is one of the north-south running streets that would be more commercial, and then what they're calling Paseo streets that run east-west, which are more of the lower scale sort of neighborhood streets, as well as sort of the waterfront frontage from those development parcels onto the waterfront park sites and the other trust lands. Those character streets get into the public right-of-way layout and those amenities. And it also talks about the base heights of buildings along those character streets and what the required step backs would be to create a distance separation of those towers and maintaining openness and sight lines out towards the water and within the development site. It also includes general design principles for building finishes and facade articulation, including the treatment of ground floors for primary retail frontages, secondary frontages, and the non-active frontages, such as the sort of utility spaces and auto and loading entries. The athletics will be given a presentation that gets more into the details. So what I'll do before the presentation, I'll just give a very quick summary of what the staff issues were that were raised in the report, and then we can come back for that for discussion after the presentation if you wish. Staff had cited.
Okay, Pete, sorry, continue.
Okay. Staff had cited a need to include more details with regard to the Bay Trail in the preliminary development plan. There was a request to widen the Bay Trail along the waterfront to somewhere in the range of 20 to 25 feet. The minimum amount of 18 feet is currently being provided. BCDC had submitted comments that they said that it should be more consistent with what you see along the waterfront within the Jack London district, and that would be in a range within 20 to 25 feet. Staff would also like to see that there's some provision for interim access to the waterfront areas west of Market Street prior to the phase 2 infrastructure and park build out. Also cited the need to provide more information on the park programming and all the amenities within the design guidelines, including info on access restrictions to Athletics Way that would occur on game days. And this is the area that would essentially be ticketed and open to the public, but there's going to be a security restriction. So people would have to go through security. So there's going to be portions of Athletics Way that come down towards the waterfront, and there would be fencing installed that would separate those areas on game day. So we would like to see information specific to that to see, you know, how does it look on non-game days? If it's folded away, is it temporary structures that they come and insert into the ground, things like that. So we'd like to see those details. We also want to see more details and cross sections of landscape and other amenities within the character streets within the design guidelines. We'd also like to see more detail and or revisions to a number of things within the design guidelines, such as the use of industrial materials within the building towers, standards for any ground floor residential, as well as building projections into the right-of-way. Another issue cited within the report is the proposed building heights, which are of concern because many of them are at a height that is exceeding many of the buildings within the downtown setting already. And they extend up to 600 feet in height for a number of the parcels. They basically go up to 600, step down to 400, down to about 200, and then closer to the water, it steps down to 50 and 100. Staff feels that if these building heights are proposed, more measures are needed within the design guidelines to address those towers. The athletics have stressed concerns over the need for these heights to be able to incorporate the full development plan that they envision. They also envision the use of and development of very slender towers. So staff's recommendation would be to look into adding in dimensional standards as those towers extend above certain heights. So all of the buildings have essentially an 85-foot base height, and then the towers can extend beyond that with the current built-in setbacks based on the character streets. But we feel that there needs to be more dimensional standards for those step backs, and as you extend above certain heights, you would then even make those building profiles even thinner to really sort of reduce the massing right there on the waterfront. I'll go ahead and conclude with that and allow the athletics to go ahead and make their presentation today, unless there's any other questions at the moment.
Thank you, Pete. Commissioners, Limon or Fearn, any questions of Pete?
Just one, just for clarification, Pete. Is it my understanding that the ballpark is not part of this discussion, the design of the ballpark?
Yeah, that's correct. Since it's really going to be its own standalone project, I don't envision additional ballparks in there that the design guidelines really need to apply to. They have the general layout of the ballpark and its orientation included, and that's also included within the whole project description and the preliminary development plan. But the guidelines are really there to sort of guide multiple sites that would be developing over time. So that ballpark will come in as its own final development permit, and that will be subject to review by this body as well.
Thank you.
Commissioner Limon.
And then, as far as the gateway crossings, crossing the railroad tracks, that didn't appear in any of the renderings that I saw. Is that being considered at a later time?
So there is a mitigation that was included within the draft EIR to include a pedestrian and bike bridge. The details of that are not known yet, but that will come in for review at a future date. There's also a project alternative that was included that is a grade separated roadway crossing. And if implemented by the decision-making body, that design will also come in at a later date as well.
So Pete, let me just follow up with one other question that Commissioner Fearn asked. The site plan that we are reviewing, to your comment about the stadium design, is integral to the orientation of the development of the development parcels. I'm not quite clear how we can't talk about the planning aspects to the stadium relative to the site.
Oh, you certainly can.
Okay.
It's just not specifically called out with regard to details in the design guidelines. And I'm sorry, I was thinking that the question was more specific to the design guidelines, so that would guide future final development permits across the other development sites. The ballpark is part of the preliminary development plan, however, so I mean that is absolutely open for discussion. But that would come in as its own final development permit in the future, potentially packaged with the overall infrastructure and street layout east of Market. And that design will be refined at that time. But the layout and orientation of the ballpark is pretty baked into the PDP as it is right now, and that's been what is been analyzed within the EIR process as well.
Okay, great. And one last question, Pete, and I'm sure the design team can share what they think. In the package that we received, there was no updated rendering with regard to any of the general things in the design guidelines that were suggested. Some things in my mind that were omitted for rendering purposes. There's no scoreboard that would have blocked the view that we're seeing in one of the renderings, and the submittal seems very plan in two-dimensional versus 3D, which is really what we're trying to understand best. So what was the request on the part of staff relative to providing that information as we've done on other projects? Pete, do I still have you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I might have missed. Was that a question for me? I might not have heard the last part.
That was a question for you, Pete, because you're quarterbacking the review process about what we have been equipped with relative to three-dimensional or current visualization of what the project is proposed under the PDP.
Well, they do have a presentation that's going to include a lot more visual simulations that they're going to give today.
So why would we not have been provided the public be able to see that before the hearing?
We will post those materials. Again, this is information that we are also requesting about to be included within the preliminary development plan with regard to, in particular, the parks and information on programming. So if there's a request to include more renderings within the design guideline package, that's fine, and we can make that request and they can include that in.
Okay, I'm only just going to say, and the design team can start, but we've had this conversation multiple times on projects. We're acting on behalf of the public. We want the public to be able to see stuff that's being discussed in a full fashion and not just at the hearing. So I'm a little disappointed in not being able to have seen this stuff, or at least had the public see this beforehand. Anyway,
thanks, Clark.
Let's move forward then on this item if we could. Project sponsor has 15 minutes to share with us the materials, and then we will open it up to public comment, and then we will have a series of further discussions and may come back to you with answers. So who's going to lead the presentation first? Richard? Dave?
Hello everyone, but I believe Dave Kaval will lead off.
Yes, thanks so much, commissioners. Thanks so much for taking the time today to review our really exciting visionary plan for the waterfront at Howard Terminal. We have about a 15-minute presentation that Richard Kennedy and also Leon Roast can review and actually go over. And we have a lot of the stuff that you mentioned in 3 dimensions and things of that nature. And we'll provide whatever information you guys need to make an informed decision. But just in general, we want to say that we're very excited to get to this stage, to get the public input on this really exciting design and ensure that it's something that's positive, not only for the A's and obviously the surrounding community, but for the entire region. So I'm going to turn it over to Richard, who's going to lead the presentation, and you can kick it off.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dave. And commissioners, thank you for your time and opportunity to share additional aspects of the project. We're very excited to be at this point. You can imagine the process to get here has been quite intensive. A number of colleagues in the city, staff, Pete and his team, among many others, stakeholders within the community, state agencies, including BCDC and state lands, have all been consulted in quite an intensive way. And that's really fed into the work you have in front of you with PDP and the guidelines. And we'll walk you through all of that. We'll start with a few design updates just to show how the design has evolved in the course of that process of engagement and interaction. We'll talk through the site plan and development proposal using largely renderings and 3Ds to supplement the PDP and guidelines you have. And then we'll talk through the PDP just as a cursory view to explain our organization thinking there, as well as key aspects of the guidelines and our organization. This was a rendering, probably the first rendering that came out about the A's development at Howard Terminal. This was, I believe, in 2018, the first concept and vision of the Jewel Box ballpark, oriented to Jack London and the Oakland skyline, close to Jack London as possible, with the adjacent developments just behind on the west-hand side, and then a contiguous public realm that wraps the water's edge. Of course, over the past 2.5 so years, the project has been evolving. Some ways big and some ways small. This rendering shows some of the larger adjustments, most notably the rotation of the dip in the ballpark, where the prior dip faced directly to Jack London. The dip has been rotated now to provide enormous amounts of views from all seats within the ballpark towards the bay and the sky. So just the simple rotation of position just gives so much more visibility from visitors in the ballpark out to the bay and that resource. But additionally, provides so much more frontage on the public side to look into and peer into the ballpark and all the excitement therein. And I'll talk through additional adjustments as we go along. On a project of this scale, we found it very important to make sure that as we shift and adjust and revise the framework and planning, it's important that it's cohesive. That there's a language there that allows it all to read as a coherent, unified, cohesive whole. That does feel that it's intuitive and comprehensible to walk around and to find your way and to encounter all of the spaces that we've been dreaming in, building into the plan. And so the framework, as we've done it, is organized in inspiration around the icon of Oakland, the oak, with all of its branches and connections. And we've used that as a metaphor for how we think about circulation in the pedestrian realm, making sure that the pedestrian realm is fully contiguous, connected, universally accessible, and that it's very intuitive on how to move and navigate around the space from one destination to the next. So it's largely an organizational idea, but it can also be a material idea in making sure that the ground plane and pedestrian ground plane is, and specifically is cohesive, unified, familiar, as well as being durable and robust to stand all the use that it will receive. And so that language carries through the entire plan, the waterfront, sidewalks and pedestrian realm, and the framework of streets as well. In this plan, you're seeing the full development blocks and arrangement, but you're also seeing the network of public spaces. All of the green and orange is effectively the public realm, the open space, the trails, the pathways, the plazas and patios and porches, and the green gardens, park spaces, and recreational spaces, making quite significant additions to the waterfronts for West Oakland and Jack London. And this is now an aerial representation of that full plan. And of course, the ballpark is the focal point, is kind of the reason for being, for the project. But the ballpark is not the only destination. Of course, you see the cranes also feature prominently as an icon of Oakland's working waterfront. Here remains as a form of architecture and artwork, kind of an anchor to the waterfront's edge. You see the future developments in the background with mixed uses and mixed heights to create variety and variation, but also the contiguous public realm along the water's edge that is designed with the intent of being very varied and diverse. We're offering something for everyone in a way to make this really a desirable and lovable waterfront for West Oakland. Of course, with projects of this scale, connectivity and circulation and transportation are always a challenge. And for the Howard Terminal site in particular, there's no one solution. It's a multifaceted solution. You can see on the diagram on the right-hand side, which is the percent of arrivals during game day. You can see that they're fairly well distributed from Market Street all the way to Broadway in terms of how people are coming there in various forms. It's largely pedestrian on the eastern side, more vehicles on the western side. But again, the proportions are largely distributed. Bicycles are then factored in the middle, specifically on Martin Luther King with a designated bike route and entryway. On the left-hand side is a more nuanced circulation diagram. The most notable thing in this diagram is the contiguous Bay Trail that starts in Jack London, wraps around the entire waterfront, going to its edges, and then has two ways of then reconnecting back to the city grid and the Bay Trail as it connects further into West Oakland. Market Street is one connection that then links to the bicycle connection on Martin Luther King. But there's also a continuous loop that allows the Bay Trail to extend along the whole waterfront and then loop back through the development. So again, more than one way to connect the Bay Trail and create that extensive network. Of course, there's also shortcuts. If you want to bypass the site entirely and get to West Oakland more quickly, a Bay Trail connection on Jefferson that quickly links you to 2nd Street and the Bay Trail there. A number of other improvements are built into the thinking, underpass improvements, transit mobility hub, just in the neighborhood off-site, and then a series of other pedestrian and dedicated bike improvements throughout the district. A few renderings now to walk through some of those advancements in the plan. This is the primary arrival moment, the kind of first arrival moment as you step through from Jack London Square. Clay Street is just behind you in this view. The estuary just to the left, and you can see the cranes in the left horizon. In front of you is the ballpark, kind of being the magnet to draw you through the site in and around that's the central feature. The ballpark has been rotated from those initial inceptions, and we think there's a number of key advantages. Most notably is that we're able to still have a picture window that's directly on axis with Jack London, that prior to game time, or maybe possibly even between innings, there's an open window into the field of play and all the energy of the ballpark. But during the innings, the screen would drop down. So you might recall in earlier renderings, there was a floating screen at the saddle point, that low point. The advantage of rotating it is that we can actually now nest the batter's eye and scoreboards in the ballpark without blocking views of the bay. So quite an important adjustment. But furthermore, the language of the ballpark now pulls you in different directions, pulls you to the right towards Athletics Way that Leanne will speak to in a second, and on the left towards the waterfront where you get magnificent views into the ballpark itself. There's also a number of logistics in servicing a ballpark, transportation, ball players, all of the servicing needs. And rather than have a backup house, one of the main urban design moves here is to actually lift up the pedestrian realm, what we're calling Athletics Way, that extends from Jack London and wraps the ballpark in a circular pathway, to lift that above the servicing. Have all the servicing then go below that elevation. So you're not interrupting with emergency vehicles and all of the ball player traffic and so on. So the pedestrians have a contiguous environment. And this is a contiguous environment that's also serves as pedestrian realm during non-game days as well, activated by retail on both sides. The other thing you'll notice in the renderings is the rooftop ballpark. That is another jewel in the overall composition of amenities for the project. This is meant to be a really dramatic way of experience the ball game for families and everyone looking for a view of the bay and all the surrounds. But on non-game days, it also serves as a public park with public access. And this diagram demonstrates how that works. There's a variety of ways to get up there. Pedestrians can enter on the saddle, go up the stairs to get to that elevated point. Everything in blue there is level and flat and fully ADA accessible. During game time, there's also the ability to connect to each of the concourses through these portals. So you can step in and out of the concourses and access the rooftop. There's also elevators that would be active on game days, but also on non-game days. So at the north and south edges of the publicly accessible area of the roof, we would have public elevators to provide universal access to this key feature. But the key idea here is that we're trying to minimize the conflicts with all the servicing that goes on with ballparks to really make sure that the public realm and the experience of the new district, the experience of the waterfront is really celebrated and heightened. And that views like this, they're now elevated above the waterfront, can be achieved. The waterfront has then a variety of other spaces that are articulated in the guidelines and the PDP. A few more spaces I'll call out. Pier Park Garden is the southwestern corner. You can see the saddle of the ballpark coming down here on the right-hand side. open, flexible lawn, earthworks to kind of create wind protection, but also screen some of the activity of the ballpark for those who are seeking quieter moments. The cranes provide that another magnet to draw people to the water's edge. Shade trees and picnic furniture to allow for diversity of uses. A continuous promenade along the water's edge that makes, I think, great prominent frontage for the ballpark as it meets the water. Different ways of navigating the grades, turning those grade adjustments into generous sloping walkways, but also steps and seating terraces, other places to enjoy the view. And of course, great garden and park spaces along the water's edge that provide a diversity of settings with different capacities, some larger and flexible like this view here, some more intimate and garden-like as shown in this rendering, with different nooks and crannies along the water's edge to provide different offerings to appeal to as broad a community as possible. So with that, I'm going to transition to Leon and let him finish some of the urban design framework and walk through the PDP and design guidelines. Leon?
So Leon, we're at 12 and a half minutes.
Okay, I'll just whip through it. Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you for your time today. I'm excited to present to you some of the urban qualities of the master plan, as well as some of the updates on the ballpark. These diagrams show how the urban framework performs on both game day and non-game day, creating a secure perimeter around the ballpark, but also allowing for the public to circulate around, including the Bay Trail access in green in the bottom left. This shows one of the conditions of the paseos that allows underground access to the back of house, so tucking all of that away out of view. The next slide shows the majority of the paseo conditions, which are pedestrian-only access points towards Athletics Way, which is the ring avenue around the ballpark above. And you can see the ramp that provides an accessible route to the top. A view of Athletics Way, a circular avenue that really draws people around the ballpark and takes you to the front of the bay. In the overview here, you can see how Athletics Way starts at Water Street on the right side of the screen, goes around towards the district, and comes down towards the waterfront. This view also shows a snapshot of the updated ballpark design. And the next slide kind of zooms in on that top tier a little bit better. We were able to reduce the scale of the ballpark by joining the rooftop park and the third concourse, which we believe actually leads to a more dynamic design and adds value to the seats furthest away from the game, and also an interaction that is kind of unpredictable with the park as it circles around the ballpark. Here you can see the saddle where the ballpark, the park promenade comes down towards that public viewing area. So there's a mound here that gives you a slightly elevated perch just behind right field to get a glimpse into the game and play. And the master plan buildings, you can see in this view as well as the next image, is sort of conceived as an extension of the bowl, so that the entire district is participating in the game and in the spectacle, perhaps not being able to literally see the game and play, but at least enjoying and participating in the energy of the game in the district.
Leon, I'm just going to give you another minute to wrap up, if you would, please.
Sure. This just is a reminder of the maritime reservation scenario, which shows that we still provide an active and vibrant waterfront. And the final 4 pages are just to say that all of the documents that you receive for the PDP as well as the design guidelines are intended to enforce and make these visuals come to life through a series of guideline principles, as well as more specific guidelines and recommendations about street characteristics, which deal with everything from massing and character and articulation and planting to ensure that this becomes a lively district and a successful district that we all are, which is our common goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Leon. Commissioners, questions at the moment, or we'll go on to public comment? Okay, so Desmona, looks like we have some speakers on this item.
Yeah, so this is staff Pete Volman right now. So for members of the public, if you would like to provide public comment on this item, now is the time to raise your hands.
I do apologize. I am back. We were in the background. Okay, so it looks like we do have several hands called. The first one I am going to call on is Ben. If you could please unmute yourself to make your 2-minute comment. And I'm sorry, state your full name for the record, Ben.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Ben Eichenberg. I'm a staff attorney with San Francisco Baykeeper.
Okay, you may begin your 2-minute comment.
Thank you. We had a couple of concerns with the some of the design guidelines and the plans that were released. Generally agree with staff that some more detail would be really helpful. First off, stormwater retention. I feel like there's not enough emphasis on stormwater retention in the design guidelines and in the plans. Alameda County guidance says 4%, and they're gonna try to meet that, but I think that guidance also states that there should be 0 stormwater discharge. And based on the level of contamination at the site, they should definitely try to have a 0 stormwater discharge policy, and that could be reflected in design guidelines and in the plans as well. There are proposed and existing storm drain outfalls in their plans. It's not stated whether those are expected to be used, but or in what circumstances those are expected to be used. But for trash and pollution control, I think those elements should be incorporated within the plans and in the design guidelines with more specificity. The municipal regional permit, section C3, requires 100% LID for new and redevelopment projects, 10,000 square feet. So I think that qualifies, and I think that should be made clear. Not enough emphasis on porous surfaces in the design guidance. So I think that more discussion of green infrastructure. There is some in there, but I think we'd definitely like to see more. There's some small bioretention areas, but it's not clear to us that they're enough to meet the needs of the site, or that the types of soils are going to be types of soils and groundwater are going to be amenable to bioretention. Toxic remediation, design guidance and plans don't adequately account for that remediation for some of the same reasons. The stormwater runoff is going to be a big issue for toxic remediation, and that should be taken into account. And finally, well, just one more note on that. Bioretention has to be appropriate for a site with high groundwater tables and soil contamination at the levels that the site has. And the public trust, finally, the public trust issue. I understand that there's been legislation on this, but there's still a few specifics in the guidance or in the plans about buildings and other areas that are proposed for public trust lands.
I'm sorry, Ben, that is your 2-minute comment period.
Okay, thank you. We just joined staff and asking for more detail on the public trust wire-oriented uses, which should be in the design guidance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And 1 second here. And Pete, I am having trouble with the controls here, so I may have to go out and come back in. Can you take over for me for a moment?
Yeah, no problem.
I apologize for that.
Okay, the next speaker is Naomi Shift. I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. You may go ahead and unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Hello, Naomi Shift for Oakland Heritage Alliance. we wrote comments. I'm very sorry, Mr. Limon, that you weren't listed on the agenda. I sent them just before the meeting. First of all, we really appreciate the inclusion of the peaker plant in this project. It is the most prominent historic building in the area that could be incorporated, and we'd like you to keep it intact, and would appreciate the design review group commenting on that. There is a big enough site here for that whole building to survive. And in its rhetorical repetition of making something uniquely Oakland, the best way to do that is to keep some things that are from Oakland. And the thing that struck me about the presentation we just saw is totally focused on the stadium, very little about the rest of the site. I feel like this project really needs the design guidelines really need more work. Our second most important comment is about that 600-foot height limit. There really are not 600-foot buildings on the shore of the San Francisco Bay. We really should not be doing that. We believe that the staff is correct in recommending a lower height limit. And we'd like to point out that if there were density bonuses applied to this project, it could be even more than 600 feet. So very important, I think, is to review those height limits and do something that makes sense and does not build a wall along the shore, further cutting Oakland off from its shoreline. I know that it was said that it was undetermined about the access across the railroad, but it is such a key part of this project that it is right there by an extremely active railroad line that it really has to be addressed in the design guidelines somehow. And I'll wrap up with this. The economic diversity idea that is mentioned in the design guidelines is not clearly fleshed out and should be. How many units of subsidized housing will be provided in the project?
I'm sorry, Naomi, that is 2 minutes.
Well, I think, no.
Enter your meeting option.
Okay, I am back.
Okay. I'm actually having problems with the controls now at the moment.
Okay, so did we end on Naomi, Miss Naomi?
Yes.
Okay, let me try to get her back.
Oh, Naomi already completed her
Okay.
minutes.
There we go, thank you.
So on to the next speaker would be Kay Epstein.
Got it, just one moment here. Okay, Kay. Kay, if you could unmute yourself to make your 2-minute comment. I do apologize, we're having some audio issues.
No problem. Good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Kitty Kelly Epstein. I'm a college professor in Oakland, and I live on East 20th. The Oakland A's proposed development at Howard Terminal design does not consider the impact of a stadium, luxury condos, and office development on the working waterfront, which is the most important economic asset of this area. I ask that you do not move the design forward until the A's have adequately addressed the outdoor stadium's lighting impact on a pilot's ability to safely navigate vessels, commit to ensuring all estuary facing and all westward facing surfaces shall extend the glare restrictions existing on the first 60 feet of the building to the entirety of that side of the building, and agreed to a minimum 500-foot buffer zone between Howard Terminal and the proposed Oakland A's project, prohibiting public access or development of residential, commercial, or retail buildings. Finally, and extremely importantly, the turning basin expansion and its related maritime reservation scenario must be prioritized and made effective as the project's principal and primary development plan. We request that the acreage for the turning basin be removed from the design Thank you. The turning basin is extremely important to the safety and the existence of our port. We would like to have more than decorative cranes. We would like the working waterfront to continue to exist as an actual operational factor of Oakland's diverse working class community. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Next, I have Mike Jacob. If you could unmute yourself to make your comment. Just one moment, let me get him back here. Mike, can you unmute yourself? Yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Mike Jake with Pacific Merchant Shipping Association, and we have a lot of issues with this project in general, but to try to limit the comments just to the issues on design guidelines and the plan development, there are a lot of deficiencies here. This is maybe the first time you've seen this, but it's the second time we've seen it because it's the same presentation essentially that was given to the BCDC Design Review Board. And with respect to the turning basin expansion, they said it looked like it was incomplete and it was an afterthought. And that's the same thing we have here. You've just taken that corner out and you haven't actually tried to redesign this to essentially accommodate that expansion. With respect to that expansion, that is our principal seaport compatibility measure. It is the only way that this project moves forward in a way which doesn't damage the port. And we appreciate the comments from Kitty Kelly Epstein on the other mitigations that are necessary to make sure that the turning basin can be used safely. Those should be reflected in design guidelines too. But that's a huge one. And then also the other one that I think is the obvious to everyone is that the design guidelines need to reflect the nature of accessing the site. And that is of critical importance with respect to the grade separations that need to be going in, which are obviously part of the project, variants and alternatives in the EIR. Those aren't reflected here, but then to say that they're not addressed because we just haven't gotten there yet, it's just not true. The design guidelines, page 48 and 49, specifically have sections with respect to district gateway frontages. But they've completely ignored the fact that in the EIR, you are going to have a grade separation question coming forward. How do you move forward with design guidelines that try to pretend that you have district gateway frontage design guidelines, but then don't address the fact that you're going to have to address grade separations? That's just silly. So, I just don't understand why you come forward with a presentation that you know is incomplete. Those are our main questions for you guys to pursue right now. And I think the proof is in the pudding. We really appreciate the staff recommending a look at the heights. And because there is such additional space, and including the density that you can get into the acreage, basic questions, I think, arise from that with respect to the expansion of the turning basin. Principally, why do you have to sacrifice park frontage if there's still space to increase density on the existing blocks? And whether or not you've actually looked at the design that accommodates that turning basin expansion. We don't want it to be an afterthought. We want it to be a principal design measure. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Mike. I do apologize for the delays.
No problem.
Okay, next we're going to have Aaron. If you could unmute yourself to make your comment.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. This is Adrian Guerrero with Union Pacific Railroad. Commissioners, thanks for the time today. Similar to comments that I've made in the past and as some of the other speakers before me have touched on today, the fact that the design has not yet incorporated the grade separations, that's multiple grade separations at the rail lines at Market and MLK remains a significant concern for us. We have highlighted the safety issues that this proposal presents without incorporating multiple grade separations for the prime access. And as the presenters showed, with the percentage of traffic for access in there, primarily coming in from Market and MLK, our exact same concerns stand. And so, we implore the city and the commission to press for those grade separations to be designed into the project. The one design that has incorporated a grade separation is a pedestrian grade separation, which is not going to be enough. The traffic, grade crossing improvements that they have proposed are purely gingerbread and a Band-Aid approach to what they are bringing with the form of this proposal. And so while we also have other concerns, I want to continue to focus on the safety concern involved with not incorporating grade separations. And again, we ask that you press on the A's and others to incorporate that going forward. I will highlight that UP is not the only one who's made this comment. Capital Corridor, ACE, Amtrak, and the California Public Utilities Commission have all stressed the same in our detailed responses to the DEIR. With that, thank you.
Thank you for your comment. And before we go further, I just wanted to reiterate that if you are having any trouble reaching our meeting, you may also submit written comments for the meeting. For the next call, I'll take Zach. You may unmute yourself to make your 2-minute comment, and please state your full name for the record.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, my name is Zach Bowling. I'm a housing advocate in Alameda. That was a great presentation. I'm generally in favor of this project going forward. And I had a couple of concerns with the previous caller, had mentioned them, but overall I'm very bullish on this as it's presented. So thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Next commenter is Susan Ransom. You may unmute yourself to make your comment.
Hi, this is Susan Ransom. I am with SSA Terminal, right down the road from Howard Terminal at 290 acres of land. As been mentioned previously with regards to the turning basin, on behalf of SSA, I would hope the Main Design and Planning Review Committee uses the inclusion of the turning basin design as the #1 plan, not the #2 plan, as a priority in discussions and not be secondary to the A's design plans. It's certainly a priority to keep port business vibrant in the future. I'm also sure the design takes into account a lot of security parameters to the park, and would hope the A's would also provide plans on water security parameters, as there are many safety issues. Along the lines of Kitty Kelly Epstein and Mike Jacobs, I will be addressing removing the acres allocated for the turning basin with the Port of Oakland to be completely removed from the port term sheet, as the port still maintains control of the land even if the A's plan goes through. There is zero reason for those acres to be inclusive in the current plans. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Susan. Next, we have Lee. If you could state your full name for the record and unmute yourself to speak.
Lee Sandall. We're speaking today on behalf of the International Longshore and Warehouse Unions Northern California District Council. We have some concerns here. The A's proposed development at Howard Terminal design does not consider the impact of a stadium, luxury condos, hotel, and office development on the working waterfront. We ask that you do not move the design forward with the A's until they have thoroughly addressed the outdoor stadium's lighting impact on the bar pilot's ability to safely navigate vessels through the turning basin in the Oakland Alameda estuary. Also, until the A's are committed to ensuring all estuary and all western facing surfaces shall extend the glare restrictions existing on the first 60 feet of the buildings to the entirety of that side of each building. And the A's would have to agree to create a minimum 500-foot buffer zone between Howard Terminal and the proposed A's project, prohibiting public access or development of residential, commercial, or retail buildings. Also, the turning basin expansion and its related maritime reservation scenario must be prioritized and made effective as the project's principal and primary development plan. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Okay, next I have a comment from, it looks like Public Bank East Bay. If you could please state your full name for the record.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Margie Lewis, and I am a member of the East Oakland Democratic Club. And as I'm not going to reiterate what a lot of the people have said, like Susan Ransom and Kitty Kelly Epstein, but just to comment that this plan is not adequate in its taking into consideration safety issues with the grade separations that the railroads and other utilities have talked about. It has not taken the public's safety into consideration in terms of the EIR, which has shown that the mitigations for the toxicity in the land that is going to be dug up to make this project happen have not been taken into consideration. So in general, we ask that you do not move this design forward until the A's have come up with an adequate design that does address all these various issues that are not. It's silly to have a design that doesn't address what needs to be addressed and what the EIR is asking them to address. And that was found to be extremely lacking at that point. So that's what we ask you to please consider. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. And next, oh, excuse me. Scott Taylor, if you could unmute yourself to make your comment and state your full name.
Yes, good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Scott Taylor. I'm the CEO and chairman of the board of GSC Logistics. GSC handles almost 16% of all the import merchandise now coming through the Port of Oakland. I feel it is undeserving for Mr. Kaval and others to say this is an exciting development for everyone in the area. That is not true. There is nothing in this rendering that we have seen that helps us. Those of us that work at the port or own companies at the port. If we were just talking about a ballpark, that might be doable. But with 3,000 condos, hotels, commercial development, as far as we're concerned, this is a non-starter because it's the beginning of the end for the Port of Oakland. All of us should start getting ready for lawsuits from residents. That's the commissioners, the city, all of the businesses. Because if I was to buy a $2 million condo with the trains going by 24 hours a day, the trucks rumbling by, the ships blowing their horns, there will be nothing but lawsuits coming from the residents. Kitty Kelly mentioned about a 300-foot buffer. I don't know why the A's don't have to adhere to the 500-foot buffer when everybody else in the area does. And finally, as far as I'm concerned, if this project was to go forward, the only way it could go forward would be 100% grade separation for the rail activity, which is happening 24 hours a day. I ask you not to let this project go forward, because if it does, it's the beginning of the end for the Port of Oakland. Thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Thank you. It looks like—
I'm sorry, this is Pete Bowman, the committee secretary. I just wanted to make a comment real quickly, if I may. I just wanted to note that prior to the meeting, we had requests to include toll-free numbers for the Zoom account that we use to hold our hearings. We did get that set up, and we added it onto the agenda yesterday. However, we've just been made aware that that function actually does not go into effect for 48 hours. So unfortunately, it is not available for this meeting. So if anybody's listening in or nobody knows anyone that is trying to call in on the toll-free number, please join through Wi-Fi, through the internet onto Zoom, or you may call any of the other numbers to be able to access. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries. Next comment comes from Evie. If you could please unmute yourself to make your 2-minute comment.
Hi, my name is Evie Huang. I'm a customs broker and freight forwarder and user of port services. Current president of the Customs Brokers Forwarders Association. We are all concerned about how the port area is going to sustain, and just want to remind that the whole port area should be a secure area. And with all the renderings, I see there is public access everywhere, and never mind that the turning basin is even included in the plans, but I don't really see anything that will prevent the public from going right on the water to the ships, to view the ships when they're turning, and that's essential for port safety as well as securing the area. And the last comment I wanted to make is that the whole thing is about the A's, and you really have to examine whether the plan really works and to see into the future if the whole plan is going to be sustained and they will be good neighbors to the port. This article in the paper on the weekend of how the built Santa Clara Levi's Stadium 10 years later, funding and everything else has not gone the way that was promised. So I would just say that everything has to be made whole before going forward with this project. Thank you.
Thank you. And it looks like I do have one final hand raised. Cheryl Walton, you can unmute yourself to make your comment.
Good afternoon, Cheryl Walton. I'm a District 7 resident. I'm just gonna go through this. Oakland A's proposed development of Howard Terminal design does not consider the impact of the stadium, luxury condo, and office development on the working waterfront. Our waterfront, our port needs to be protected. You can look at San Francisco and tell what has happened over the many years. Right now, they are just a commercial development. They no longer do container types of port operations. This will impact the operations on our port, no matter how you look at it. And if they are going to, A's have to, if they are moving forward, they will have to adequately address the outdoor stadium's lighting impact on the pilot's ability to safely navigate the vessels through the turning cycle, committed to ensuring all estuary facing and all westward facing surfaces shall extend the glare restrictions existing on the first 60 feet of the building to the entirety of that side of each building, and agree to create a minimum of 500-foot buffer zone between Howard Terminal and the proposed A's project, prohibiting the public access and development of residential, commercial, or retail buildings. And finally, the turning basin expansion and its related maritime reservation scenario must be prioritized and made effective as of the project's principal and primary development plan. We request the acreage for the turning basin be removed completely from the design. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Cheryl. And if there are no final hands, this is the last call for comments for this item. If you would like to make a comment, please raise your hand now. All right, Chair, I think it's back to you.
Terrific. Thank you all who spoke on this item. Let me bring it back to the commission for questions of staff, of the project sponsor, and then maybe we can we'll move on to comments and things that we want to discuss. So who would like to begin? Commissioner Limon, do I see you? Okay, go for it.
So, several of the public raised the issue of the glare and the lighting and the pilot's ability to navigate the water safely. So I for some reason, I thought that was addressed in the design, and I'd just like to hear from the applicant around that and the glare issue also.
Actually, this is Pete Bowman here. So these were a number of comments that we received on the draft EIR. So these comments will be fully responded to in the final EIR response to comments. So I just wanted to note that for the record that many of these comments that came up were items that were raised as comments on the draft EIR, and it's more appropriate for those to be responded to in that document.
Okay, Pete, let me jump in from Commissioner Limon. So as design guidelines and criteria, to Commissioner Limon's comment, how will they be reflected? I understand your comment on the CEQA analysis, but how will they specifically be represented and identified relative to the controls that we would be moving forward if we do?
So you're referring specifically to the question about the lighting?
Yeah, I think it's probably a broad question.
So for lighting, we always have standard requirements that are sort of outside of design guidelines. It's just standard requirements where all the bulbs are basically pointed downward, the bulbs are shielded, much easier now with LED lighting that you typically see. But the idea is that you're not shooting, glare from lights off site. Obviously, a stadium proposal is much different because you do have that field lighting. But nonetheless, all the lights from those standards are directed down towards the field and are not directed off-site. You can certainly see them off-site, similar like you can when driving by the Coliseum for a night game, but all of those lights where the beams, they are directed down towards the field.
Okay, back to you, Commissioner Limon.
Yeah, and so I guess the follow-up would be, again, several of the public commented about the turning basin being sort of the primary plan to be reviewed. And, I understand that the port, I guess, still has about 7 years or so left on that option. But, would that be considered to be, outside the scope of what we're doing here? Will it be addressed in the EIR, or is that something we can push?
So what the maritime reservation scenario covers, it covers what the site would be with the maximum take back of that land. So it's showing sort of the complete range. So right now the turning basin is being studied and analyzed by the Army Corps, I understand, with the port. And it's not for certain project that's going to be going forward in the future, but it's something that they're looking into. There may be a very high likelihood that it goes forward. But again, that is being studied. So what this preliminary development plan is addressing is the full extent of, in the event that there's no turning basin, it's the full project site as it is today. And then there's various amounts of that 10 acres that may be pulled back in order to accommodate an expansion. So what it's showing in the maritime reservation scenario is that maximum extent of what that expansion could be. So it may be somewhere in between the two. It may be just a little bit less, it may be nothing at all, or it may be that full extent. So that's really something that's unknown at this point in time until they complete that study for that separate project to decide how they want to proceed on that. So it'd be speculative at this point in time to put anything else in between. So it's really what is the baseline is as the site is today, and then showing the maritime reservation scenario, which shrinks it down to the maximum extent under that take back by the port in order to do the expansion.
Thank you, Pete.
Commissioner Fearn, go ahead.
Yeah, just to kind of build on that, related to again, kind of going back to Chair Manus's question around how the guidelines respond, if it's admittedly a tricky thing to respond to because it's obviously hypothetical and we don't know how much, or all we can kind of do is state the minimum, the maximum. But does I didn't see in the design guidelines how the waterfront would necessarily be treated differently, or if it needed to be treated differently if the maritime take took place, and does that need to be something that is spoken to in the design guidelines? Because at least, I don't know if I missed it, but I certainly didn't see it discussed in there as part of the waterfront district.
Yeah, so as I noted in my report, we're requesting that they provide more information on those waterfront parks, period. Okay. It is very much lacking in the document, and I think they need to incorporate that in. It may have been because they were not certain of what direction BCDC or State Lands wants to go with those spaces, but I think they need to put information in there that kind of guides what that development is. And, you know, the big change would be is that instead of having a wide open park with the cranes at the end, it could potentially be whittled down to being more of like a larger promenade with, you know, park moments along the way instead of as much large open space. But it would still be of a similar percentage to the overall site area of the project. You know, they could certainly, you know, one of the things that we specifically asked is to clearly define that walkway. So if those parks end up shrinking down, then, you know, some of those parks that are shown in the full plan may or may not completely go forward. But I think what the design guidelines can show is what would be the general programming of those park spaces. And if it ends up being not the full extent of the Maritime Reserve scenario, maybe that area just shrinks. But then those design guidelines that kind of lay out what will that park area be like would still be implemented, but maybe we're in a smaller square footage or area. With regard to the buildings, I'm not sure that anything would necessarily change with regard to how the building should be designed or built. I think the guidelines as they're laid out now, you know, in addition to, you know, the further information that we're requesting that they put in there would still hold mostly true. Granted, some of the corridors that, you know, the character streets that they discuss would shrink and maybe go away, but then you obviously don't need to apply those guidelines to, you know, land that is no longer there. But once again, I mean, it is difficult to try to project to something that we don't know what that scenario is going to ultimately end up being. But I think once they incorporate a lot of the information on the parks, that could really be applied either way.
Got it. Thanks.
Pete, I just would tag on to Commissioner Fearn's comment that a visualization of what that, you know, turning basin removal area would look like, you know, as a part of the visualization of what the maximum would be an essential part of, because, you know, nobody knows, and you are correct in saying it, but it's a 50-50 chance that the turning basin is needed or not needed. And so in the course of at least understanding what it would look like, or at least feel like, I think Commissioner Fearn is correct in at least in raising that we would really need that. And I don't feel that we would want to rely on words, because this is a very important part of the connection to that estuary. Commissioner Fearn, Commissioner Limon, other questions?
Sure, I can jump in. There's a couple
Go, please.
Larger scale. Pete, can we, you know, kind of tagging along with Commissioner Limon's questions around what we heard in the testimony, and another thing that came up were the grade separations. And can you just speak about why those would not be included in these design guidelines? They do seem like they are key connections and a key issue related to, you know, access here. I'm just curious, you know, what was the logic behind that?
Yeah, so actually I had a discussion with one of my comments early on was actually to provide, you know, what maybe the approach would be while going across the pedestrian walkway. You know, what would that look like on entering the site? I mean, I think that's certainly something that could be added in there. You know, what would the treatment be of those? You know, if you're, you know, coming across the site, are there banners? What kind of, you know, lighting is there? You know, I think those kind of details, I think, would be good things to add in. For the grade separation, I mean, at the end of the day, it's essentially going to be a roadway if it is required as part of the project. Like I said, right now it is a alternative within the draft EIR. They've responded to that to show what that would mean to the block layout within the preliminary development plan. So they do acknowledge that. And I think what might be useful if you wanted to address grade separation would be, how does that underpass area look? I mean, obviously the roadway is going to be the roadway. You know, they could address certain things. Are you going to put banners on it? What are you going to do? But I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to be another, you know, if implemented, it will be another grade separation that unfortunately once again, kind of divides the waterfront from the area, similar to 880, though not quite as large, obviously. But how you address the underpass of that, I think, would be something that really could be helpful in the design guidelines.
Yeah, likewise. Okay. And then talking about just shifting to height real quick. You know, I obviously see on the proposed plan that there are 2 blocks that I think it's parcels 10 and 11 that are 600 feet in height, or at least proposed that way. But I thought I read in the guidelines that it just referenced a 600-foot tower. So is the concept that there would only be one tower of 600 feet? It could just go in these two different blocks, or is the assumption that both of these blocks could allow a tower that gets up to 600 feet?
Yeah, the way it is set forth in the preliminary development plan right now allows the 600 feet on 2 blocks. You know, as I mentioned, I think what could be done, and I can let the applicant to speak to that if their intent was to only have one, but it is shown on 2 blocks within the preliminary development plan. I had not heard otherwise. But like I was saying in the presentation, I think what we can do is implement a series of tower dimensional requirements that could be built into the design guideline document that becomes more of a actual standard, similar to, you know, the setbacks from the streets and the base heights, where you take on a certain, you know, just using, you know, one of the 600-foot blocks as an example, maybe you say above 85 feet, here's your dimensional requirements up to 250 and then up to 400 and then up to 600, where you start cylindering the tower as it extends higher and higher. So that was just a little further clarification on the recommendation that I made in the staff report. But my understanding and what's included in the preliminary development plan at the moment is 2 blocks that allow 600 feet.
And then just related to that, well, not necessarily related to that, but, you know, I know staff is proposing that there would be shorter heights. And I believe that in the maritime reservation scenario, the applicant is stating that the massing and heights wouldn't change on the blocks. And what I'm curious about is in the heights that the staff is recommending under the maritime reservation scenario, would heights need to increase, or would they also remain? Did they also do a study under that condition to verify, or at least kind of check to see if the heights could be maintained in a shorter massing?
Yes, I didn't get into that specific of a recommendation of what it means for the height when if the shoreline pulls back. Okay. You know, I think the recommendation that I have right now is that, you know, obviously there's you know, if you want to address height, you can always say less height, but, you know, based on a proposal right now and what they would like to see as part of the development with the slender towers, a lot of times the slender towers are not as impactful because they do step back and create spatial separation. So if that were to be incorporated, staff thinks that that would be an acceptable compromise, and looks to guidance from the DRC as to your thoughts on this as well.
Got it. Okay. Here, I just have a couple other kind of minor questions.
Keep going, Commissioner Fearn.
Right.
Keep going.
You know, one of the questions, one of the comments that we heard from Naomi Shift at the Heritage Alliance was the preservation of the Pier plant. I would agree that it would be desirable to keep the full thing. Do we have kind of any dimensions of, you know, what's driving the reduction? I mean, what are if it's a pedestrian kind of oriented street, you know, how wide is it at the pinch point where the Pier plant comes in, and has that been kind of looked at and studied, and was there reasons behind saying it needs to be partially demolished?
Yeah, and honestly, I can't remember what the dimension of the pinch point is off the top of my head. I'm sure the applicant could probably throw that out there real quick. But yeah, the idea is just that, I mean, and I just want to clarify, the whole building would be retained. It would not be demolished. It would just be a section of the wing that would be trimmed back. And they're showing sort of the maximum extent of that, because that needs to be shown, and that was taken into consideration with regard to processing of the draft EIR and analyzing what those impacts would be. Could it be less? Potentially, yeah. And I think that would come up at the time when we start to review that and see maybe are there ways that you could maybe partially keep it and open it up where people could kind of walk through, or does it really need to pull back so that you can really make that circulation work better? I don't know if somebody from the design team wants to jump in real quick if you have that number off the top of your head of what the pinch point is right now. Is currently designed with the existing building wall into projecting into Athletics Way.
It's if somebody has it offhand, I don't need to necessarily look it up if it's.
I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but it is roughly going from 75 feet of width to roughly half of that.
Okay.
Right. I think at its narrowest, it's 30 feet in width. And the other consideration, it's a subtlety, but there's also sea level rise and grading adjustment issues. So historic buildings, as the whole site's being raised, add to complications. So it's dimensional, but it's also elevation and grade changes.
I appreciate that. I think a couple questions for the applicant here. One of the things I was reading about Athletics Way and the character of the street is that it should allow for diverse forms of activation. And I'm just curious, it seems to me that that's one of the more important streets. I understand. I think Market Street is kind of where the retail wants to be aggregated or at least have a focus, but shouldn't this be shall rather than should along Athletics Way? I can't imagine kind of a more important area that you would want the ground floor activated. So I'm just curious what the thought was behind that.
Pete?
Yes, I think we could. Is that a question for us?
Yeah, I think it was a question for the applicant, but I do want to note that in the preliminary development plan, and this is something I had actually was going to add as a comment, and then I was trying to remember where I'd seen it. There's actually a note on the preliminary development plan where it notes the ground floor active spaces, and it's not shown in the preliminary development plan because the grade change between the rest of the site along Market and then as it moves up on the Athletics Way, but there actually is a note saying all the ground floors on Athletics Way will be active spaces. So it will be, the idea is, I believe, to have it as active retail. But yeah, I agree with the whole issue of the shalls and shoulds. I've got a comment in there too, and I think we will work through a lot of the shalls and shoulds and leave out what we need to leave out from the design guidelines if it's already incorporated in the preliminary development plan. Obviously, there's going to be, some scenarios where there may need to be portions of the building that need to be allocated toward lobby space or something like that, but I'm sure we can work the details of that out. I'll go ahead and let the applicant respond to the specific question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's correct. We feel there are quite a few toggles in place in the guidelines to ensure an active pedestrian realm. We can, of course, re-examine the exact wording, but we also wanted to provide a degree of flexibility considering that there are a lot of constraints on those blocks and providing enough flexibility for the design to play out on those blocks as well, while ensuring enough guidelines to create an active ground floor experience.
Okay. And then just a question around mobility, micromobility. I appreciate the diagram that shows how people are anticipated to come here. And, I do get the sense, obviously, with the parking that, most folks are not going to be coming via car. But I guess what I didn't see, and maybe it was kind of alluded to in one of the greater circulation diagrams, but, I understand people coming by foot, by bike, but they also might be coming by scooter or by ride share. How is that being handled? I just didn't see how those kind of uses, because I imagine those would be overrepresented for this ballpark, would be organized and thought through on game days and non-game days, because they do affect the public realm in terms of, how those cars come and go, especially when people, you got 35,000 people trying to get out of there at the same time. And a number are going to be obviously going to be using rideshare. So I'm just curious where that's thought of. And I saw that there was a a transit hub or some kind of mobility hub a couple blocks away. Is that where that's being considered, or if you can speak a little more on that thought?
Well, I'll jump in and say a few things. And Leon, if there's any other emphasis to jump into. The plans and diagrams that we're showing for all the circulation modes are at a point of full build out. As with all transportation efforts, we're building off of the intelligence and the current systems we have in place now. But as over the course of the next 5 to 10 so years, things will evolve too. And so the current plan is assuming that in the first phase of the project, much of the site is left undeveloped on the west-hand side and can serve as surface parking to allow for fans and visitors to start adapting to other modes. As the bus routes and the transit hub get established, and even more technologies like scooters and shuttles become in place. So that's the first thing. There will be surface parking in the near term. In the long term is when all of the various modes kick into play. On 2nd Street, there is a multimodal transit hub that is meant to be a connection between buses as well as the ride share along that stretch adjacent to the project. And that's been in coordination with the city and coordinating those routes and making sure they're sensible and work with the other networks. There's also pedestrian improvements, underpass improvements at Broadway and MLK in order to facilitate pedestrianization of those spaces, to make it much more appealing to be walking from downtown to Jack London and to the ballpark. And we think that with these improvements, all of these various modes will distribute the various ways that people do come here. Anticipate that diversity will only increase over time. Does that answer your question, or the team has anything else to add?
I appreciate
it. Richard, let me jump in and follow Commissioner Fearn's query on that, because I guess I want to make sure that we heard you right. The build out is actually 25 to 40 years and would not occur when the first phase of the project occurs, because I think that's what I heard you say relative to compatibility. Did I understand that?
No, I mean, as a project like this takes years to fully come to fruition, and largely the phasing is going from east to west. The ballpark and eastern blocks first. So east of Market Street is first, the early phases. Everything west of Market then follows. And in those intervening years, everything west of Market, effectively as the site is today, and can be used for parking and circulation access and other informal forms of activation. But as the site develops, the various modes then become more diverse. And I think for the whole region, we're hoping that people become more comfortable with alternative modes of transportation too. And so the project anticipates those diverse forms: buses, shuttles, bicycles, scooters, walking, as all those modes come into play. And so that diagram that we described that shows the percentage of access from Market Street all the way to Broadway demonstrates how all the modes would distribute quite evenly along that stretch.
And this is Noah Rosen with the applicant team. I just have maybe one more thing to add here. Given the importance of this issue, transportation and circulation to the site, though the details of those issues don't actually live in the design guidelines or the PDP. They have their own dedicated documents, which you can find in the draft DIR. So for the ballpark, it's the Transportation Management Plan, or the TMP, and for the non-ballpark development, it's an outline of the TDM plan, the Transportation Demand Management Plan. So both those documents outline the circulation plans, capital improvements and programmatic improvements in much greater detail than we're discussing here.
And I understand that. No, I guess, thank you for that. I think where I was going is that sometimes these TDM plans and the space required to have an organized TDM program do affect the public realm. And so I think that would need to be reflected in design guidelines, because, you know, one of the things that I was thinking about is, it goes to one of Pete's comments, is that I just didn't see a lot of how the public realm was treated, particularly along the line. I mean, I saw there were right-of-ways, and we talked about trees and landscaping and lighting, but, you know, one of the questions I had was, you know, what's the sidewalk hierarchy like? How does that look? Because that affects you know, how the buildings are going to be situated and things of that nature. So, you know, is the sidewalk on Market the same size as or the same width as the sidewalk on Myrtle, or are they different sizes? Because all those affect the development footprint, they affect the public realm. And so if you are making accommodations for ride share or scooter share or whatever it may be, that may need to be thought of in the public realm. That was the
understood. Yeah, the street cross sections are detailed in the PDP that was, I think, attached to Pete's staff report, and we have considered that hierarchy you're discussing.
Those are the questions I had, Chairman.
Okay. Commissioner Limon?
Yeah. So I guess, Richard, if you could talk a little bit about just the parking in general, sort of the overall scope and access for patrons versus residents or workers. You could just talk about that. You know, the plans obviously show parking, you know, at the lower levels or at the base of the buildings. So yeah, I'd just like to get a better feel for that.
And Pete, I might ask, can we post up a plan? I know we're talking a lot in words here. It would really be great if we had a plan that we could be talking to as these questions are being asked. Maybe Richard or Leon.
Yeah, if one of you want to pop up the site plan from your presentation, that would probably be helpful.
Sure, I'll do that right now.
Thank you. Great, thank you very much.
I might actually just go do a circulation diagram just to start, given the question is about access. As I was mentioning in the earlier response, the western half of the site, everything west of Market, you know, for the first many years of the project is that surface parking. And then the pedestrian access, you know, from downtown and Jack London, which would then largely focus for all the access on the eastern side as the first phases are developed. Once the project is fully established, the individual towers would have parking for those residents built into their bases. I believe the guidelines, and I'd need Noah to verify, but the framework allows for the potential for a west side parking bank here to support the overall access needs for those ball game days. In the event that by the time the project is fully developed, that modes and preferences and haven't evolved that much, and there's still a lot of reliance on parking. So there's flexibility built in to establish that western block, which is adjacent to the more industrial edges of the port, to be that parking bay. Alternatively, there's individual parking for the residences, office uses, and hotel, all built within their individual parcels. And those would be, you know, multi-level to accommodate the quantities that are required.
So with that in mind, are some of those floors, will they be able to convert? Let's say that demand is not so high, to convert to other uses?
Yes, I mean, that's the intent, is that there's, you know, they're designed with possibility with floor heights so that they can be converted to lobby uses, ground floor uses, and alternative uses. So the proportions in the floor layout is you know, is established in the guidelines to allow both functions to occur. So there's flexibility there.
Right. And then as far as like unloading and loading of semis, let's say for a major event, a concert, it looked like that there was some access on the perimeter of the stadium that goes below grade. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. So I'll show this diagram here. So orange in this upper left diagram here is vehicular. So, and the thickness of the diagram equates to capacity and volume. So thinner the line, the less traffic is anticipated, thicker, the more traffic. Primary vehicular entries for servicing as well as visitors and residents and game day users would be on MLK as well as Market Street. For players, for servicing, for VIP and all of that access that goes under Athletics Way, the route is as follows: come down Market Street and then enter into one of the two vehicular paseos that Leon had shared. Right, there's two different formats. There's the vehicular paseo, which has pedestrian ramps that flank the buildings and a ramp down below Athletics Way in between. And there's the fully pedestrianized paseos that have stairs and switchback ramps and vegetation planting to make those pedestrian environments. But the vehicles would come on, service vehicles and loading vehicles would enter below Athletics Way on one of those two passages, access all the servicing needs then below, and then exit out the other, and then connect back to Market Street.
So it looks like, given that they can access the perimeter, that there should be plenty of capacity for, like, let's say, I understand like Chase Center's had some issues with their loading and unloading of semis during concerts. And so with this sort of thought, there should be plenty of capacity. Does that sound about right?
Yes, that's the plan is, and there's a lot going on under the ballpark. There's a lot of space down there, but there's also a lot of uses. And so all of the vehicular tracking diagrams have been formed to show that the trucks can come in and do a counterclockwise rotation and meet all the turns and access to the loading. And that's a key dimension to have worked out. And that was set up as the ballpark were evolved.
And so with that, do you envision, like, let's say the workers on those special events, not necessarily vendors or the retail, but the actual, let's say, for example, union workers who are building the stages and moving the equipment, would they have access to park there, do you think, or are they kind of on their own?
I can chime in on that. This is Noah again. There'd be very limited parking underneath that Athletics Way service area. It would be primarily used for players, maybe about 100 spaces. So employee parking would not be located under there in large numbers.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to get a sense of the scope and potential impact. So no, this is helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Limon. So let me start with a couple of my comments and we can sort of go through this. First, I want to thank Pete for a very detailed staff report with a lot of questions in my mind that I think this hearing basically has brought out. And so anyway, so thank you, Pete. And I think we share a lot of the same views that you do. So I'm going to be very specific about some of them, and I'm not sure whom might be best to respond to them. Let me just sort of talk for a minute about the height and the assumptions there. And I'm going to ask Pete, and then I don't know whether it's Richard or Leon or Noah who can talk about the tower assumptions here, because I want to ask about them. The use of density bonus is assumed to be a given part of the height that is being granted. That's a question for you, Pete? Or would we see density bonuses that would push the heights that are proposed here beyond what is being proposed?
So as it stands right now, the project is fully baked in on this maximum unit count. If they wanted to alter that, there's CEQA implications to that. So they would actually need to go in and open up CEQA again. So that would be, a revision to that process, at least in the form of an addendum and further analysis. As I noted with the general plan amendment they're asking for, the PUD kind of locks in what the development proposal is. So that is the project. So that is taking into consideration the number of units. If there's units built on site, it would be part of that 3,000. For any affordable units, density bonuses, it would need to come forward right now, but they're basically creating a PUD that says this is what the building envelopes are going to be.
Okay.
At the maximums.
Great, terrific. And then second part of that, Pete, is I know there's been discussion on the deal points about the affordability and the 450 units. There's no resolution or staff view on the whether they be on site.
That is an ongoing negotiation right now. That is being negotiated with the group that's doing the development agreement, and I'm just staying in the loop.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so let me pose this question to whom can address it. I want to talk a little bit about the height and the assumptions there. Who would that be on the design team?
I think it depends on the question, but it would probably be myself or Noah.
Okay, so in this region, there is no ability to actually do skinny floor plates in any economic model. I've been practicing in this region for almost 4 decades, and anytime that project type has come forward, the project has never lived. So I question that relative to the 600 and 400 feet that is being proposed. With that said, the other thing that I'm sort of curious about relative to, and we'll describe it in the broader terms of equity, that super high rises, because their cost premium, generally become beyond market rate and become luxury. And I guess the question that I would pose to either Leon or Noah is that strategy you're talking about here relative to what those mean?
Is the strategy to develop super luxury, super premium units on site? Is that the question?
I'm asking the question that super high-rise, small floor plate buildings precipitate luxury condominium projects.
Actually, Commissioner, I can take that. Dave Kaval here with the A's and with the development team. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's certainly a valid point, but I think our perspective is that the 600 feet and the larger towers are something that provides some flexibility to the developer and to the project. And we feel that it can be done in a respectful way for the entire success of the project.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Thank you. I realize it's your point of view. I will tell you, based on lengthy experience, that that's never going to happen. And I'm concerned about the heights there. The second part of this is the city went through a very elaborate process on Brooklyn Basin using type 3A construction. I think the density for many of us on the commission is not an issue. Why is there not the ability to actually look at that as a reasonable alternative relative to the scale? Because I am in support of what the staff report is describing as the heights are exceptionally too high. I think the bigger thing for me beyond the equity, and Dave, what you might believe is the developable capacity, it basically pulls the core and the focus of the downtown of the city to the waterfront and not into the middle of the city, which I think is not a particularly effective city building process. So I'm posing the question relative to why I feel like the heights that you're proposing are beyond what is reasonable to assume. I know Commissioner Limon mentioned this earlier. I worry about the scoreboard and the views of the scoreboard from those units that are facing behind home plate and the glare associated with them. And in general, if you look at Oracle Park, the amount of light in the air around that stadium is actually pretty significant, and you were proposing a very dense project. I understand, certainly, in order to facilitate creating a stadium. So I just want to add that. I do agree with some of the comments of the speakers that I think the project with the turning basin reflected in this within the next 7 years is a given part of it. I think that what I've heard and what I understand is that whether it's a 50-50 chance of doing, I do think that it's one that I think is worthy of making sure that we understand what the implications are. I think Commissioner Fearn really was touching on that associated with the waterfront character and what that alternative would do. With that, let me see if I have a couple more points that I wanted to make. So I guess I want to sort of come back to my fellow commissioners, and Pete, maybe you can sort of help us through this process here. What I've heard in the hearing and what I've shared is there seem to still be a lot of loose issues that are really not resolved. I understand the importance of moving this forward for the A's to be able to take the next step, whether it's in Oakland or it's in Las Vegas, in whatever their deal might be, and we're reviewing this solely on the basis of design. But with that said, I sort of feel like we have not been afforded the seeing what those variations might be as we typical in design review in an effort to have the commission be prepared to understand that and not just act on it. So Pete, maybe you could provide some insight into what that process might be relative to what you understand the path would be on this project.
So I'm sorry, just to clarify the question, so are you essentially asking next steps?
I am asking next steps because, as I said, I think there's a fair amount of loose ends here, particularly based on the testimony and based on a lot of things that are reflected in your staff report. How would DRC be able to review that in a subsequent hearing in order to be able to field the issues that have been raised as part of the testimony or other issues that you flagged versus it moving to the commission directly?
So, we are trying to move forward at a pretty expedited rate. I would expect that the A's will take the comments today, make revisions to the documents, and then resubmit those to staff for review. Those documents will be posted on the city's website through Excella, at least. I've actually created a project page that keeps the preliminary development plan and associated guidelines on there. So as revisions come in, they will be posted there. Anybody is free to take a look at those and provide any additional comments. If the committee does want to see it back, you can certainly make that request. That's within your right. Often on a lot of these projects, we will take direction and incorporate those in. And if we feel that direction has been achieved, then we will take it forward to the commission with an explanation of that. Maybe sometimes it'd be a few outstanding additional comments that we have that they need to incorporate in or add as a condition of approval. But, that's often how we've dealt with in the past on some other projects. Some other projects come back again.
Okay. Commissioner Fearn or Limon, other thoughts here as to where we are relative to the discussion on the proposed project?
Yeah, since I won't be on DRC for the next meeting, I just wanted to give some feedback. Overall, this is a really exciting opportunity for the city and for the waterfront. And, there are issues related to the coexistence with port facilities and port operations. But, as long as the A's are able to work it out, I'm excited about this project. And looking at the sort of the thought process that has gone into the design of the stadium and the overall sort of feel and placemaking of the entire district. I think it's been tastefully done, with a lot of thought and and sensitivity to the character of Oakland. Sure, there are a lot of things to work out, and I think the public has made that very clear. But overall, I'm excited about this opportunity. So wish everyone best of luck on continuing to move this forward.
Thanks, Commissioner Limon. Commissioner Fearn.
Yeah, so I do agree with the chairman. I think there are some obviously some outstanding items that need to be handled. I just related to the guidelines themselves, just a couple of comments that I had that I just wanted to state for the record. I do, and if again I've read this thing about 3 times. So if I miss something, let me know. But I think that there does need to be some guidelines, some setback guidelines for residential uses on the ground floor. A lot of the guidelines kind of talk about that residential uses are going to be allowed on the ground floor, but I think there needs to be something stated kind of what that would look like if there really are residential uses on the ground floor. I didn't see kind of lighting guidelines for Myrtle Street, and given the fact that Myrtle Street is kind of the back of House Street, to just want to make sure that this street doesn't start to feel kind of like a dark alley. So I think that's something we just want to state. And I do, obviously, I think, Pete, your comments I support in terms of, increasing the width of the Bay Trail and recognizing the street, reorganizing the street layout and so on and so forth. Related to the tower guidelines, I do think, regardless of the height, and I also feel that the height is a little outsized in this location. To Commissioner Manus or Chair Manus's point, I think that we don't want to create kind of 2 downtowns, and we're trying to generate activity in our own downtown. And so I want to be careful about kind of what we're doing in this realm. I obviously want a note of activity here. I'm not opposed to height in general, but I think competing with height with the tallest buildings in downtown doesn't feel quite right to me. And so I do think that we need to establish some kind of tower design guidelines similar to what we have done in the downtown related to base, middle and the crowns, on some level to kind of give some guidance to how we want these buildings to look. And I'm just throwing out those examples. I'm not saying that necessarily needs to be the case. What we're seeing in the rendering certainly, they don't show that. So, but I do think there need to be those need to be spoken to. I think, in terms of, keeping this on track or if it's expedited, I understand that. I think, as perhaps a compromise, there's always a DRC summary section in the staff reports that the commission gets. I think that would be a good way for at least the three of us to check to make sure that, what was kind of stated here and what was kind of raised here was adequately addressed. And then, Chair Manus, there's always the opportunity, if we're not satisfied at commission, to bring it back to DRC for anything that, may be outstanding at that time. So that would kind of be my recommendation. And then obviously this is the PDP. There's still the FDPs that would be coming before the commission as well for further refinement, before, shovels start hitting the ground. So I think there are a number of ways to have some checks as this moves forward. So I would be supportive of that if others are.
So, well said, Commissioner Fearn. I think you captured that, and I want to assure the design team and Dave Kaval that, to Commissioner Limon's points, we all want the A's and the associated development to succeed. I think there is probably a great desire on our part to be effective in that. With that said, the things that we have heard at this hearing, which give us all a little heartburn relative to either grade crossings or turning basins or building heights or stuff like that, the design team in terms of the ground plane has done, Richard, a very thoughtful job and a lot of the stuff. And I think what we are all trying to emphasize is that this is a real Oakland infill. It's a very important infill. I think Commissioner Fearn echoed my comment, which is that we don't really want a second downtown, which is where this is going. We don't have a problem with the scope of the uses that are needed to finance and fund a ballpark village. And I think then with that, and I want to turn it back to Pete for a moment. I think the first question for that I would pose to you, Pete, is that the material that was presented today by the design team will be posted following this hearing.
That is correct.
Okay, terrific. The second part of that, I think, and Commissioner Fearn described it. I think none of us want to be an impediment to the process here. We are a recommending body in this case, both through DRC to the Planning Commission, but we do want all the issues basically laid out on the table so that we understand the trade-offs or accommodations we're making with regard to the variety of things that are there that I just think that, and this is Dave, I will have to say this is an unusual part of the process here, that this got so far down the road and that the commission and the DRC were never part of the dialogue. It was your decision perhaps not to do that, but my heartburn is that it's too baked, and we didn't really have any ability to basically share what the public might be. You may have gone out, but the commission or the DRC is really part of the process of trying to make sure the public hears all the issues, and we heard a lot of them. So let me then summarize Commissioner Limon and Fearn if we're in this place. Pete, one, they're going to get posted. Second, we would like a process that you could help outline for us that would allow us to be able to either have another DRC, or as Commissioner Fearn says, as we've done in the past, move this through the commission and bring it back to DRC relative to a response on some of the items we flagged in an effort to move the process forward. And so I will rely upon you now to help sort of guide us in what you think the most effective way to deal with this, the sort of iterations that we've all described.
Yeah, so often that has been the case where there's a project that's approved and or commission moves it forward and basically adds a condition saying these further refinements shall be included into the design guidelines, and those get brought back to the designer for discussion. That's certainly been the case in the past. Hopefully that with the comments put forward today, we can get a package that responds to the comments that I've raised in the staff report, plus additional comments today that are focused on, design guidelines and PDP issues. And hopefully we can get that all incorporated in, and we can bring it forward to the Planning Commission and have it in a summary explaining what was incorporated in, so we can move it forward, and that doesn't have to be a concern.
Okay, so that would mean this sort of visual variations on some of the things we've talked about. The other thing that I would request too of the design team, that if this item will get moved to a commission hearing, that every one of the visuals that's going to be presented at the hearing is delivered to the staff at a time so that the public and both the commission have adequate time to see it. It's, you certainly raised the bar on the graphics from what was in the submittal, and that's very much appreciated, but being able to see them at the hearing and not before, and being able to understand that, I think, is a critical part of that. So let me just sort of take a minute and ask Richard or Leon if you have any questions or any things that you perhaps want to share with us relative to the comments that we've shared with you.
No questions from me, commissioners. I would just say that we're grateful for the feedback. I hope you see that we are taking this effort very seriously. We want to get it right. We want it to be a loved place. It's projects like this are challenging in any case. but let alone, with the uniqueness of a ballpark. And so, we are trying to thread the needle and build the right set of mixes with the right character and feel, and a diversity of attractions that make this something that all of Oaklanders and folks from around the region want to experience, even if they're not A's fans. But if you are an A's fan, it really will be something, I think, very deeply meaningful. So appreciate all of your feedback. It's all taken to heart, and we'll build as much of a response as we can in our next issue.
And just to sort of reaffirm, the commissioners individually are available if you need further feedback. And maybe with that, Dave, I know that we really wanted to focus this on design. So I apologize for, just sort of, you were not the spokesperson here. We were trying to look at the design character and stuff like that. Any comments that you want to share with us relative to our requests?
No, just that we appreciate the thoughtfulness in kind of reviewing our design. And I think we will incorporate the feedback that we heard today to make sure that we can have an even better project. So I think it's very positive. So really appreciate it.
Okay, terrific. Okay, Pete, with that, I think, commissioners, I think that we're complete with that item. Pete, anything else you need from us on that?
No, thank you.
Okay, so then, any other items to discuss? No, I don't think so, right, Pete? And I can adjourn our meeting, correct?
Let me just double check the agenda right quick.
So make sure we don't adjourn.
Add that the next DRC is on
Thank you.
the 2nd of September.
Thank you, Ms. Armstrong. And the chair will rotate to Commissioner Fearn. And Commissioner Limon, thank you very much for being on DRC. I think we've all got great insight, and Commissioner Ray Lynch will be joining us on the commission at the end of the month on our regular time. Correct. Thank you, Ms. Armstrong.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, I will adjourn the meeting at 5:08. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night.
All right, folks, the meeting is adjourned. We've left the meeting, and I'm actually waiting for Mike Jacobs to join us. I was going to have a separate program with him, but I thought with the audience here, why not take advantage of the fact that you're here? He has something to say. He said he was going to run down to the bathroom and then come and then hop on. I sent him the link. Some of your comments here, I think Barry Lee, I don't teach as saying, I don't think it's going to be somewhere. If they move to, it's going to be Vegas. The league wants to be in that market right now because the LUMB is going to, okay. Then let's see here. We've got not confident in Oakland handling of this. It's over. I don't know. I read differently, folks. I don't read that it's over. I think you would know there was a problem because Dave Kaval would have said there's a problem, and the planning commission is, the design review part of the planning commission is really just a recommendation body. They're not voting, but also this is a process that is applied to many different projects in Oakland, not just this one. This one just happens to be, of all of them, the most high profile. It is a test in your patience with democracy, and is here after very much of a focus on developing a government that's responsible for people regardless of representative size. In other words, the minority is heard in Oakland. And that's what you hear play out here. I mean, sure, a lot of the comments are, some that just kind of make you say they just come up with that because they don't like the project. And there is a lot of that, particularly today, because we have this haves versus have-nots economy that we've allowed to build. And even now we've got people who are losing their unemployment that they got and their benefits from the federal government. As a billionaire and a bunch of millionaires and thousandaires work to build something that, at the end of the day will make them richer, they hope. So, but then it involves a city, which is supposed to help the people who have the least. And we're in a situation where that number threatens to grow dramatically. We're in the middle of a crisis. We're in a situation where this American economy is impacted in a way that we've never experienced before, ever, okay? Where even we had other pandemics, we didn't have the gigantic degree of foreign direct investment in the United States that we have today. We didn't have the degree of foreign visits to the United States. Why is that important? That's dollar flows into the economy. But the pandemic has shut that off for the most part, okay? Shut it off. So I haven't seen a calculation yet. I thought about doing one, and I will at some point in the near future, that shows just how much of an economic loss we're facing because we don't have standard foreign dollar flows through the country. And then you have people making money from cryptocurrency, but under Janet Yellen, they've done everything they can to stomp it down. And now you have Coinbase that wanted to set up a lending program. And they said, well, that's a security. Really? So all of this that I'm talking to you about is happening in the face of this project. And in a city that was once very affordable to live in is now more expensive in some areas than San Francisco, which in decades past would be thought of as unheard of. That's where we are at. We have legislation, AB 464, which when it used the same enhanced infrastructure financing district concept to get billions of dollars. Yeah, I said billions with a B to small business if it's used. City of Oakland hasn't used it at all. So, that's where we are. And, in all this, we have my friend, Mike Jacobs. How you doing, Mike?
Hey, thanks for having me.
You got it, man. I was giving everybody a recap about where we were here. And because we have an audience of 30 people now. And folks, this is Mike Jacobs. Mike is my friend who is the great lawyer for the Longshoremen and the East Oakland Stadium Alliance. And a big proponent of an alternative plan, I would say, even though I think he would very much like it if the ballpark weren't built at all there. He wanted rather have it be at Coliseum.
Yeah.
But, Mike, you look like you lost weight.
Oh, well, thank you.
I was right?
Actually, I'm training. I'm 6 weeks out from Ironman, California in Sacramento.
Ironman.
I was actually out at 6:30 this morning swimming off of Keller Beach, Point Richmond. Did a mile at dawn. That was fun. That was good.
Nice. I gotta ask you, what the heck brought that on?
Middle age. Trying to keep up with my wife. I don't know.
I was gonna see. You know what you said it for me. I was thinking in the back of my mind, the wife's back there somewhere pushing him. So
the joke for getting in shape when you turn 40 is that your other two decisions are get a sports car or divorce. So
neither of which I've had the pleasure of going through.
I didn't use those either.
I had a sports car. Divorce, I haven't had the pleasure of. Well, did I just say that? Enough of this. All right. On the more serious periods of, what did you think of the hearing?
Well,
by the way, Mike, could you do me a favor?
Sure.
For people watching, tell them what you do from your position and what your position is, so that they can put the proper context to where you're coming from when you talk. Okay.
Yeah. So, so I'm as you said, I do legal work in the maritime industry with the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association. In the context of Howard Terminal, we're working with a coalition that includes other maritime interests, including the longshoremen and truckers and the railroads, and really we want to make sure that our interests are well represented with respect to preservation of the industrial transportation operations at the Port of Oakland. That's as far as PMSA goes, that's my day job up and down the coast, and this isn't the first time we've run into these types of frictions between the development of potential sports venues and preservation of the working waterfront. We have a lot of development pressure and a lot of context for that. I think is probably well known to your viewers just in general, because that's why we have land use controls. That's why California isn't Houston. We go out of our way to make sure that sensitive receptors, which is the planning name for people, aren't immediately next to and downwind from, large industrial operations like ours, where we have negative externalities that we're happy to acknowledge that exist, and we're even happier to work to avoid.
Yeah, what's that famous legal case in law school, Rylands versus Fletcher?
Well, there's a nuisance one. The more famous one that I would point to is Village of Euclid, out of Ohio. It's a Cleveland suburb. Set the parameters for the first planning, where the U.S. Supreme Court said you can have planning powers as a local municipality as part of health and safety, and it isn't a taking.
Yeah.
And that's the baseline of what we have here is the question of how do you develop property in the best interest of the city and the region and the state in the long term. Those are I think the fundamental underlying issues here. And it transitions into today's Planning Commission hearing to the extent that the design review process is really important, even though people don't really have a good sense for what it is or how it works, because it's a part of entitlement that is pretty unique. It's essentially when a project applicant gets to come in and essentially open up the plan to the folks that are ultimately going to be voting on the project and say, what do you think? And it gives a forum for the public to come in and say the same thing. Here are some things we find concerning about what you're doing with respect to questions of design. and that's something that usually developers jump at. You want to have basically a free bite at the apple. You don't want to get down the road too far towards having an up or down vote on your entitlement without having had some feedback first. And so what was somewhat fascinating at the meeting today was hearing from the commissioners that what it sounded like was a bit of a scolding of the A's for not having taken advantage of that opportunity early. And I don't remember the exact quotes off the top of my head, but I mean, essentially saying that they felt that this project was a little bit too baked to be at the design review phase, basically saying the A should have come in sooner and sought their advice. And so those issues that they were talking about really, I think, went to some relatively big components of what that entitlement is going to look like, including what's the massing for this project going to look like, what are the project heights, and really what's the scope and scale of the footprint of these buildings.
Hey, quick question. How much of this is the city's fault? Because I go back to when I was at Cal in planning school, Peter Bosselman was a instructor, and he had pioneered this way of building a model of a central business district. He'd do it in San Francisco and do these wind studies. And it became advanced to the point where they're actually making animations of whole cities. And this is what year? 2021. That was the 20th century. And yet it seems like all the tools that we have at our disposal, we're just talking about Berkeley. It's just right over, it's, right over there, right? Although I'm 3,000 miles away from it, but for me, it's still, as a graduate, it's still right over there. But I digress. My point is, should we have some way of cyber being able to drive through or walk through Howard Terminal to see these things in action? We can do that now. Shouldn't that be the city that does that? Isn't that something? I mean, if I were city manager or the mayor, I would say, yeah, this is what I want. This is a technology I want us to use.
I think the city should be asking for more of that type of presentation on a project of this size.
Yeah.
And I think we heard some of that from the Planning Commission today. They were asking for some updated visuals, and they didn't get a lot. I think to your point, the question of how this really looks and feels is important, and that's because it's such a big project and it wants to have an iconic and lasting impact on the city, that people should be asking for that type of detail. And I think that was part of the frustration you heard from, at least from Chair Manus today. And it's some of the things that we've been talking about too. I mean, when you really want to get down to brass tacks, when you're talking about our issues on the transportation side and how it interacts with project design, we talked about the two main places where that happens on site. One is at the northern edge of the entire parcel, which is where the railroads are, and how do you access the site, and what do those grade separations look like? And then on the southwest corner, what does the site look like when you do a turning basin expansion?
Mm-hmm.
And on the turning basin side, the draft term sheet is pretty ambiguous about how this would work, and so are the design guidelines. But they really treat it like an afterthought, and they just say, we're just going to cut out the parks. And but in a design guideline, what you would want to do is you would want to present the commissioners with several options, and you would want to say, what direction would you like me to go so I can maximize the public value of this space while not compromising or degrading my ability to maximize the number of units I have. And the staff report actually for today did a relatively good job of setting the framework for that discussion by saying, here's what the project sponsor, the A's, are looking for in terms of the height of the project entitlements versus what we think they could actually load at lower heights in terms of maintaining the density. Well, there's an envelope there, which also means that you can maintain density across the entire site, but still also preserve some open space and park front. And take that same logic and move it to the other side of the site on the grade separations. One of the early reasons why we heard that the A's didn't want grade separation was because it would eat up acreage on the other side. Well, if you've got a couple 100 feet of potential clearance between what the entitlements are and what the design guidelines are looking at for massing, you've got room, right? You've got some space. And so those are the types of things that, you'd kind of hope that A's would come back with. And to your point, one of the ways that you could envision that happening is through giving people some different massing views of that space, where they could say, if we're taking out acreage on this corner for the turning basin, this is how we think we want to accommodate the number of units that we have. If there's some acreage that's taken out on the other side, this is what we think we need to do to accommodate it. And the fact that that isn't happening goes back to my main gripe with a lot of this process, which is the approach by the A's to it has been to accelerate and not contemplate, right?
Yeah.
It's not how do I make this work for the most amount of people. It's how do I get this done fast for me. And that's not how planning's set up. Planning is set up to be deliberative and slow and methodical, and tortoise and the hare, and that's for good or for ill. We've all been frustrated with our process for getting entitlements about how slow it is and complex it is unnecessarily in many respects. But sometimes it's necessary.
I'm curious though. Let me get one thing out of the way and take me out of the equation, because I've got some folks here that have some very basic questions, because they are, admitted novices, and they're the public, right? And they're also fans. So Barry Lee asks, he says, if I can get this to Pier, isn't the Howard Terminal basically abandoned, or do ships still use it? Now, you and I know that, I want to put this outside of what we know and share it with folks like Barry Lee, who's a long time. Yeah. That T-shirt he's wearing is Mike logo. Sorry.
It's a great question. So if you I'm 2 blocks from Howard Terminal. If you walked over there right now, there's a ship at berth, and there are trucks taking containers in and out of that terminal 1,200 times today. So it has a look and a feel of an active terminal, but it doesn't have a master tenant with a lease. So that means there's no marine terminal operations that are occurring in a traditional way there. And we don't use the ship to shore gantry cranes. So it isn't being used to load or offload any vessels. So we do hear from people saying, oh, the terminal is vacant. It's not vacant. We hear that it's not being utilized. It is being used. But it certainly is not being used in the traditional sense with respect to ship-to-shore cranes. We do have a ship there, but that ship is not actually being serviced by those cranes. And we do have containers on site, but those containers are not being lifted on and off a vessel. They're being staged, they're being moved. The chassis are there, the trucks are there, but the equipment to load and offload those containers from those chassis is not there either. So it is not a traditional marine terminal, but we do use it. The statistics in the EIR was in the neighborhood of some 320 or 340,000 gate transactions at Howard Terminal in 2018, 2019. So it's pretty substantial.
I wonder if I can pull up the maritime option here while we're looking at that and get your thoughts, because I think that would be a preferred outcome given the way things might go, eh? And I'm basically a fan of it myself. And let's see if we can get this in the appropriate map. And that's not the appropriate map. However, let's look at images. Maybe when the images will give us the alternative here. I believe that project overview does not include it. There's one with a turning basin.
There it is at the bottom. Yeah.
Right here?
Yeah.
Boom. Okay. I was trying to figure out if I can move this over or highlight it. Well, I'll do it like this. I have a feeling if I take it over and then go down, maybe there's a gallery. Okay, that's one. Then there's this. Yes? Is that coming up here? Yeah. Wait a minute. It's not coming up there. Hold on a second. I'm making an assumption. That's what happens when you fly blind. You got one panel over instead of the panel that you want. So I believe this, put this in here and then click on it and then boom. No. Didn't work. Hold on a second. This one. Yes. Come on, Zenny. Undrunk yourself. This one. It's not, I scroll down here. Let me see what's going on. It's not opening the gallery in StreamYard, so I think I'm going to have to. Yeah, it's not. Let me see here. Okay, it's not. Let me get rid of this one. There. And then let me pull up the other one. Share this screen. You stop that screen. Go back. Share this screen. And we've got. Let's see this one. Yes. Voila. There we are.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, we are there. So okay. Now, that's the preferred option. Can you discuss that for the viewers?
Yeah. So you see the outline there in the bottom left-hand corner. That's the western corner of the site. Is where the terminal is now. And those hashes represent what would be removed. It represents under different variants between 10 and 15 acres of the total site, which is around 50 acres. So it's not an unsubstantial portion of the site. And it takes away 2 full city block parcels of potential development, and then a lot of open space and the development portion of the plan that included a performing arts center also gets removed. And the question really is under the scope of how that works. In the case of the design guidelines, what happens with all the park and open space that was there? How do you maintain the number of units on less acreage, which means higher density for those remaining parcels? And ultimately, there are some additional residual questions with respect to parking and things like that. And it really is, from our perspective, the only way that you move forward in a way which is compatible with what we do in the long term that allows us to grow.
I'm circling the area he's talking about with his hand. You see that? It's not a glitch. That's me moving that hand. That's the area that Mike is talking about. Has there been any movement on this with respect to the A's or the city? Has either party said, "Hey, you know what? We need to implement this"? Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the good news is that the port very specifically included the maritime reservation scenario in the term sheet that it had adopted with the A's back in spring of 2019. And so moving forward, it is now part of the project description. It was included in the draft EIR. And so the city's acknowledged that it's there as the lead agency in the preparation of their environmental docs. The A's know that it exists and that it could potentially change the scope, scale, and size of their entitlements. And then in the ensuing 2 years, what has happened that's really positive is the port has taken the next step, which is engage the Army Corps of Engineers, begin to do some preliminary engineering studies and review that are necessary before you take the next series of steps, which take a really long time, by the way, for the Army Corps to identify projects, to go through a NEPA process, to identify the project, ultimately through an act of Congress and a Water Resources Development Act reauthorization bill, and then ultimately to get appropriations to start that project after all the environmental clearances are done. That's a multi-year process. It doesn't happen soon. And that's why there's a lot of emphasis on what do you do in the ensuing years with that space if Howard Terminal moves forward. Do you still want to put in public amenities for that space? Do you still want to create some sort of public access for that space? How much improvements do you do?
how much of a parking improvement do you do if it's intended to be a temporary space? And then, the question I think for us is, when you keep coming back to the project, why do the A's keep promoting the full site development project? Everywhere you look, you don't see this version.
No.
That's why we have to explain it. You see the full build-out version. But they can't finance the full build-out version as long as the maritime reservation scenario still exists in their entitlements, because they can't build anything there. They can't underwrite anything there. They can do some limited revenue generation, but basically it's limited to parking.
FYI, if I may, real quick, that $12 billion final build-out is really a wish list. That's not something they have financing to do. And it's something that Dave has admitted on my show. And he said that they would welcome a developer partner to get to that next phase. And there's been a lot of, I mean, for example, you think about that 12 billion and you start actually filling in the square footage amounts and when they would come in down the road, if you forward them to the 16 years and you try to build 12 billion, you get over $9 billion of tax increment. And what bothers me about this whole discussion, Mike, is that's not considered in terms of the sheer power monetarily of the project and what to do with that money, and therefore drive these developments. And my point is, if the A's are bent on causing that amount to be built, even half that, or 7.6 billion, then we should make sure that at least $2.5 billion is built year one to activate the base year assessed value, so you really get a big chunk of that tax increment at the back end, Yeah. And yet, what's so frustrating about this is that kind of dynamic thinking does not even enter this project.
Yeah. Well, and I think that goes a little bit to, this question that was coming up in the Planning Commission meeting today, but it just reemphasizes the point. If essentially what you're talking about is balancing your entitlements, then you haven't changed that valuation very much under the option we're talking about. And actually, when you've gotten rid of acreage, it's mostly open space.
Yeah.
And so the tax increment value for that is nothing.
Yeah. I mean,
it shouldn't change.
And that's the thing about it. I don't mind losing that, right?
It shouldn't change the math very much.
Yeah. But when I say dynamic, folks, I don't mean like when I say so dynamic. Dynamic means it changes with respect to. That's what dynamic means. And so they could have a matrix of sources and uses based on the size of the bond issue and when they want to do it, phasing in. I did that way back in '96 when I was proposing a different type of redevelopment for the city. So it's doable. It just boggles my mind why. I mean, how do you? Let me ask this and let me help Barry get me out of this, okay? Barry says, is there hope the ballpark is built that Howard Terminal would get a major lease tenant, considering they don't have one right now? That doesn't necessarily get me out of it, but that's a interesting question.
Yeah, I think the answer to that in the short term is no. From our perspective, I mean, what we're really doing in the industry right now is consolidating around larger acreage, and this is one of the things that I think, unfortunately, that we might not have enunciated very well, and it's something that we get a lot of questions about. So I think Barry's question is really good. Howard Terminal is not likely to be a large container terminal ever again. And so when we get that thrown back at us by folks, they say, well, you know, that you just don't need that acreage. And that would be true if the only type of shipping that we did in the world was by container, but it isn't. And whether or not we needed additional acreage for other types of seaport supporting services, which we do. So I maybe I'll just leave that with people that there are different ways you can use different types of land. But within our sector, it is exceptionally hard to find both working waterfront property that would be used as a marine terminal, but also supporting property that can be used for ancillary services to support what we do. And if you don't do it here, you do it somewhere else. Or to put it another way, if we aren't maintaining acreage here, we either won't be doing the business here, or you know, we'll just be hauling cargo a lot longer distance to stay in the Bay Area. So, you know, I mean, it's kind of a zero-sum game. Either you have the acreage here or you don't. One of the reasons why, you know, LA and Long Beach is so huge as a port destination is because it has the Inland Empire, right? You don't have the type of business you have there unless you have all the support and ancillary services and the warehousing that's millions and millions and millions of square foot of warehousing space. We just don't have that. But what we have done with Howard is we've made it essentially an open air warehouse where we can have containers sitting for a short amount of time and equipment, and cargo owners can move to there and stage. And that's a good thing. But that's a relatively short-term use. We've only been doing that for a couple of years. Right now with the pandemic, we've been seeing record volumes. We have essentially a virtual 100% rented out and built out warehousing and distribution center portfolio on the West Coast. Then we have no vacancy basically on any square footage anywhere. So we just have high demand for industrial transportation property. So we want to keep as much of it as we can.
I also asked, he says, where was it? Is it even feasible with COVID now to be able to redevelop at Howard Terminal? I mean, I'll take that one. Yeah, you know, Barry, I think where we're at is I hate to use the term new normal, but look, I don't know that the virus is going to go away. I hope it does. I hope we find a cure for it. I believe it was person made and it got out, and how it got out, I don't know, but it got out, and it's got too many variants for me to believe it was an accident. But it doesn't mean we stop building. I think we'll, and this is something that, you know, I'd like to hear what you have to say about this, Mike, because I think that the way this is impacting our governments and our lives is that governments have to pump more money into the economies to make up for the market value that's being squeezed out of them because of the cutoff in this movement-based system that we have. Yeah. I mean, you know, the number of people that that aren't here or can't travel from other places in the world, that hurts us, you know.
I think it's super practical. Maybe the more philosophical answer, though, is we're always going to have more people. We're always going to have more pressure. We will find a way to coexist with this virus like we do with every other virus. And, you know, people will eventually be looking for places to work, places to live, places to recreate, and places to socialize. And so the pressure is always going to be there. You know, what we want to do in Oakland is smart transit-oriented development. How do you take this core, which is always underperformed, and create value out of it? And in the process of doing that, we want to facilitate a conversation where we ask the question of how do we densify our core? How do we create equity? How do we create economic development? But also, how do we preserve our industrial lands we've invested billions of dollars in, and make those two transportation networks that are really kind of at odds with one another, one moving people and one moving goods. How do we try to make them as seamlessly integrated as possible? And that's hard, and it takes a lot of money. In LA, we spent over $1 billion building the Alameda corridor in order to essentially segregate and separate trains that were on 4 different tracks moving through South Central LA between the ports and the rail yards that were in East LA into one trench that's 20 plus miles long. And it costs a lot of money, and it frankly does not add a lot of value to the supply chain, but it's what you have to do to facilitate the type of growth we're looking at. We don't have that here. We don't have the volumes to support that. But we do have a sizable port, and we're kind of in a catch-22. We're big enough to have all of the impacts on our neighboring communities of a big port, but we're not big enough to be able to facilitate the financing for a lot of the infrastructure that you can pay for in Southern California.
Hey, the $250 million that the Port of Oakland is supposed to get from the state of California, if the maritime option were selected, wouldn't it be more likely that that money would be spent on Howard Terminal?
It's a good question. It's a question that we are looking forward to having a conversation with the state and with the port about. There are no guidelines associated with that pot of funding, and it's something that they're not just gonna. I don't know. You've been around for a long time. I have too, Zenny. Have you ever seen the state just write a check to a local government and say, "Here you go"? That ain't happening. So there are going to be a lot of considerations about where that money goes.
It'd be nice.
Yeah. And what are the strings attached to it? And what does it get spent on? And so, I think there's a lot of need there. We could spend that money with a ballpark. We could spend it without a ballpark. The question is going to be, how are you prioritizing it in the regional context? How are you prioritizing it in a local context? And how are you prioritizing it in a state context? We know what a regional context is. That's why we have an RTP. That's why, MTC goes through that process. At the state level, we know what the CTC guidelines are, the California Transportation Commission guidelines are for when you spend money out of the TSEP, out of Prop 1B, out of the new gas tax money. We know what those parameters are. And then the local programming through Alameda County Transportation Commission, it just got done. They just updated their 10-year plan. So there are not stadium projects in any of those plans. So that doesn't mean that they could not potentially be funded out of there. That doesn't necessarily mean that that door is open or closed. It just means no one's even started to have that discussion about the parameters for how that money gets spent. I think you'd be naive to think that money just came out of nowhere, independent of the fact that there was a proposal for Howard Terminal. Right. At the same time, I think you'd be naive and pretty foolhardy if you just walked around like a couple people on, online are doing, just saying, they just got $250 million from the state. Nope. So, it's going to be something in the middle, like everything else, where there's a process. People have to make priorities and decisions about what's going on. And I think in the long term, I don't think the state of California wants to set the precedent of telling local communities that they're going to be in the business of subsidizing mitigation measures for local stadium projects either.
I can tell you that the A's were under the impression they were getting that check, and I know because a certain birdie told me that. So, but what happened between there and there, I don't exactly know.
Yeah, I think if that was the case, they would have appropriated the money to the city of Oakland, and they would have actually said what it was for. And they didn't do that. They said it was for the port and left it wide open. And we've got a lot of existing needs at the port. We could spend that money now. We could spend it on all kinds of great separation projects that already exist and we have underway that need some gap financing already, even without this project. So looking forward to that.
And Mike, we'll wrap this up. I know you got to get home. We'll wrap this up in 9 minutes. I think I'm getting to know you by your expression there. But and you know, whenever we meet in person, I don't want your wife choking me like
like I said, I did my workout this morning, so I'm okay.
Barry Lee asks, are there plans for Howard Terminal to eventually have apartments in addition to retail space? Well, Barry, those buildings in back are just that. Okay. And let me just, I had closed those panels, but let me call up the build out one, or Howard Terminal Ballpark District. Get some images here, and I'll just pull any one of these up here. Go to StreamYard, go back to StreamYard, excuse me. My computer's being humorously uncooperative. Okay, there, and allow, and voila. Okay, Barry, you see these artist renditions. Let's just take look at any particular one of them. Basically, these buildings are not all offices. They are, like, for example, let's take the initial one. I'm trying to find the right. I'll do it this way. I click on all, and then it'll click me to there, and we'll scroll down here, and then go down here to the gallery. And I'll pop this bad boy out. I believe you can still see that. Yeah. Okay. Those structures are not all offices. They are market rate. The original idea was to have market rate, but then the negotiation now is to have roughly 35% affordable housing. When I took the idea of using tax increment financing to Dave Kaval on the 17th of April, on the 4th of April, 2017, the idea was, because I told him you're not going to be able to get this thing done without building affordable housing, was to use it to subsidize affordability on the site and around Jack London. And that was the idea. Somehow they got disconnected from that, and now it looks like they're back to that discussion. But the bottom line is, Barry, the idea is to have some combination of apartments there. You can rent. Art Clark says, ask Mike about the feasibility of growing the Port of Oakland just across the estuary in Alameda. It's open space from the port. He says, come on, let's think win-win, ballpark and a bigger port, something like that. What do you think about that observation, Mike?
That would be incredible if there was a way to actually get to and from Alameda. And I say that with all seriousness. The development of Alameda Naval Air Station has been such a hot potato for decades, and a lot of it has to do with access and transportation. If you look at the original alignment for 980, it points right at Howard Terminal, and it points right across the estuary. That's not by mistake. Mm-hmm. But there's absolutely no way that you're going to expand any direct highway access to Alameda in that direction. But that was certainly part of the original plan for why you did that alignment. Alameda. You just can't take that space just because it's there. I would say if the Oakland A's were more interested in developing on that side of the estuary, that would make more sense than trying to take port operations over there. They have a hell of a view of the city, but they have the same access problem.
I never thought about that. You're right. That would be basically,
especially if they're going to build the gondola. Problem solved.
Basically, take Howard Terminal, put it over there. So, yeah. Hey, so in closing, folks, this segment, stop, but I'm also going to knock off the part with Mike and make it a separate deal. So, Mike, got some closing thoughts for us?
No, thanks again for the time. I appreciate it. I appreciate you, giving me the forum and having the ability to talk to people and have people ask really basic questions, because I think those are really important. We don't talk about trade in our industry and the port and how it works, and normally that's a good thing. If we're in the news, it's because something's wrong. So really appreciate the ability to just kind of come and just be honest and say it like it is.
Real quick, let me clear this up, because this person says the port the only opponent to the ballpark left. The Port of Oakland's not the opponent.
No, in fact, they have a term sheet with the A's, and I think this is probably worth closing on, is that our big issues are twofold, right? One of them is a philosophical question of, should this ballpark and the surrounding development go in this location? Is that good for the city? Is it good for the region, the state? How does that work? And then the secondary question is, if you're going to go forward with that, what do you have to do to mitigate the potential impacts for what we do? And that's where I think the biggest disconnect is in this process right now. We're going to all fight about whether or not this is a good place for Howard Terminal, whether you like it or not, and people are entitled to their opinions, and that's what happens everywhere. That's what land use is. But you're not entitled to an opinion about whether or not you should actually want to make the investments necessary to keep the port whole and growing, because if you are willing to let that go, then that's a totally different proposition. And even the A's have agreed. And, the biggest boosters for this project, the mayor has said very directly, we want to maintain our working waterfront and your ability to grow. And we appreciate that. I think, we take that at face value. We do think that that's what people want. They want a win-win. But it's expensive to do it right. It's going to take time to do it right. The A's want to do this fast and cheap. And that's where we have the biggest heartburn about the project moving forward. But tonight's Planning Commission meeting, I think, shows one thing, and it answers a question that we've had before, Zenny, which is, are the A's still interested in doing the blocking and tackling on the ground here at the city to move the project forward? And I think the answer is pretty unequivocal. Yeah, they are. So they're not walking away from it. They might still have a disagreement about what the terms with the city are. They might still be trying to use Vegas as a leverage. There might still be a kernel of a real process in Vegas that we don't know about. I know you've talked to Dave about that directly. But I can't do anything but speculate on that. But from what we're seeing here, they are still committed to this process. They're still going to move forward with it. And why wouldn't you? You're on the cusp of getting entitlements to, a bunch of acreage in the heart of San Francisco Bay Area. I mean, there's absolutely no reason to walk away from that. So
that's a great point.
Let's keep going.
Yeah, some of the people that are involved, like Greg Carey with Goldman, they could structure the same deal for Howard Terminal. Just because he's talking to them with respect to Las Vegas, doesn't mean he might be saying, hey, look, if I have to compare the two, here's where I think you are Howard Terminal. Here's why I think you should stick here versus Vegas. I would be surprised if that kind of conversation to some degree wasn't going on, right?
Yeah.
I just didn't see that. Hey, so what's the next step? Alameda. What do you think about the Alameda situation before we close out real quick?
Just just to follow up on where we were before, you know, I don't see how you don't impact. If this is your question, Zenny, I don't see how the project doesn't impact Alameda. Some of the comments in the draft EIR process from the city were about issues that we've all known about for a long time.
Yeah.
You know, the backup on the tube. How do you maintain the relationship between keeping Chinatown and the traffic from Alameda and freeway on-ramps and off-ramps while you're developing Jack London? How do you keep all that traffic moving without impacting the locals and the community? And that's been an issue. That's why it was part of the ACTA package back when we did prop or measure whatever it was, measure B. When did we do that? That was 10 years ago, at least. Our half-cent sales tax measure for ACTA.
2012, I believe, something like that.
Yeah. And then again, as part of the base shutdown, we had dueling lawsuits on both sides of the estuary about 20 years ago between, you know, the city of Oakland and the city of Alameda on making sure that there's proper investment in the ingress and egress there, who is responsible for the traffic. That's going to be ongoing. And certainly that's only going to intensify as the economy comes back, as you get more and more development in the Jack London area already on the natural. You know, I used to live down here too, just 3 or 4 blocks down towards the Amtrak station. And just getting on the Jackson Street on-ramp was a nightmare. But then when you would add in, when Alameda would have, you know, its monthly antique fair and all that other stuff on the weekend, it was just a nightmare. And now what I've noticed is pre-pandemic was once people started using Waze and all the other apps to avoid 880, there was a bunch of cars streaming onto 8th Street and 7th Street during the middle of the day. That commute just complicated itself. The connections to the tube on Broadway were tough. So yeah, those are real issues that you're going to have to deal with that the ballpark complicates. But to your point, Zenny, and maybe this is a good place to leave it. If you have a complicated problem, and then you put into that mix the ability to create a project that's going to generate a lot of potential throw-off revenue, you should be investing that back into the infrastructure that helps everyone in the neighborhood. And that's not on the, you know, that has not been part of the conversation. And that's been unfortunate. And that's been unfortunate for us on the opponent side too, because we're trying to make this pie bigger. The A's are busy fighting with City Hall over $352 million of their own identified offsite improvements. Well, those offsite improvements don't maximize value in this project, and that's a problem.
Right. Mike, thanks a lot. Stick around the backstage. Hey, everybody.
Okay.
That ends this broadcast. Tomorrow, we are going to have a live stream for the Cowboys visiting the Buccaneers. What promises to be an epic battle, the Cowboys will win. All right, folks. Subscribe to Zenny62, bookmark oaklandnewsnow.com.